Hello, and welcome to Autumn's Notes app, where we explore all things written, filmed, and otherwise recorded for our collective research and yapping purposes. My name is Autumn, and today we'll be breaking down Season 2 of the Percy Jackson TV show. Percy Jackson is the book series that got me into reading when I was like 8 years old. I absolutely love the series. It's full of memorable characters, clever humor, and just a lot of whimsy. Even though it's directed towards a child aged audience, I think it's drawn fans of all ages. And I'd say a lot of readers like me, who got into the books when they were younger and are now a bit older, still have a lot of love in their hearts for the Percy Jackson series. So, anytime I talk about the franchise as a whole, that's where I'm coming from. I want to say that up front because I'm going to spend a lot of this video being critical, and I don't want anybody to accuse me of hating the Percy Jackson series or having a vendetta against Rick Riordan. I really treasure his work and the joy that he's brought me and so many others, but I also think we have to make room to critique the things that we love. And don't worry, I'm gonna justify all my arguments. I didn't rewatch season 1 for this video, firstly because I frankly didn't know if I could do that to myself, and also because it's not the main focus. But I will reference moments here and there as they're relevant. I'll do my best to give you accurate information, but there's a chance I could make a mistake. I hadn't reread the Sea of Monsters book in a while, and I actually watched the first 2 episodes of the season before I started my reread. From there, my process was very simple. After I watched each episode, I would reread the roughly corresponding portion of the book, and I would use sticky tabs to make notes on similarities, differences, and any other points of note. I mean, look at all this, right? It was a lot of fun to annotate, and once I finished a section, I would make notes for that episode. While I do love to yap, I wanted this analysis to be as thorough and intentional as possible. And with that, just know that I did not go into this season looking for every little thing wrong with it. I have my problems with season 1, but I love this universe, and I was excited to see how the show could grow and improve. There are a ton of shows with subpar first seasons that found their footing after a bit, and I really hoped that the feedback from the community would help the writers course correct. I don't think most people who critiqued season 1 came from a place of this series should be cancelled. I think they genuinely just wanted the next season to be better, and they gave specific examples of how that could be accomplished. We'll first discuss some overarching elements like the writing and the visuals. We'll then take a look at each main character and some of the side characters, how they work this season, and how they compare to their book counterparts. Finally, we'll go episode by episode and cover book to show changes, and in general, what worked and what didn't. You should know that in lieu of actually recording clips from the season, I have elected to represent scenes through puppet show dialogue. You'll see what I mean when we get there, just because it was far too much of a hassle trying to figure out how to screen record, but I think it's going to be fun. Editing Autumn coming in here to say I did find a way to record clips from the show, so there's going to be like 2 or 3 clips of the puppet thing, and everything else is just going to be normally like screen recording, so just go along with it. I still think it's fun. And while I'm here, I just want to apologize for the extremely inconsistent framing and lighting throughout this video. I am getting used to filming, and I promise moving forward I will get those things sorted out. So bear with me, but I still hope you enjoy the video. Okay, back to the video. I'll try to mention the book less at first because, in part, I do want to assess this as a season of television and a piece of entertainment media. At the same time, you should know that I never treated the show as a completely separate entity from the books, and as a result, I could never claim that my opinion is an objective judgment of the show alone. If I tried to enjoy the show as an isolated piece of media, then this video wouldn't exist, and where's the fun in that? Oh, and one last thing, spoilers for the whole show and the whole second book. Also, the conclusions that I draw are my own opinion and should not be seen as telling you what to think or saying that you're a bad person if you disagree with me. Okay, with all that said, let's dive into the video. The first thing I want to talk about is the writing. Season 1 of PJO, as I'll refer to the show from time to time, was pretty notorious in that regard, specifically for something called the exposition problem. The dialogue largely served to get information and context across instead of fleshing out the characters and their relationships. It was kind of info dumpy, where one or more characters would just unnaturally convey lengthy background info. Perhaps more egregiously, there were several points where characters came to convenient conclusions on their own without much reason or evidence. Like, they just knew things that they wouldn't realistically have known just to speed up the plot. Viewers took issue with this for a few reasons. One, it's just a boring way to convey information. When you're adapting a written medium to a visual medium, you have different tools at your disposal to engage the audience. We're watching this show because we want to see the world brought to life, not because we want to hear things explained for scenes at a time. That works in a book where the action can pause for paragraphs at a time while a character thinks about something, but it doesn't really work in a show where events need to flow in real time. So instead, the writers essentially took those paragraphs and incorporated them into the dialogue, which came off very strange. It was an extra hard blow because a lot of the scenes that fell prey to this treatment were some of the most anticipated in the show. The Lotus Casino scene, for example. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm no fan of the original movies, but when I watched that scene as a kid, it was really exciting to me. The vibrant colors, the music, just the overall atmosphere, I could completely understand how the characters would get caught up in that. Beyond being a boring way to deliver information, though, this kind of writing really undermines everyone's intelligence. The viewer for acting like they need things spelled out to them, and the characters for denying them of the chance to solve problems and come to conclusions with the information at their disposal. It seems disingenuous when they just know things, and it denies them the ability to be clever or think on their feet. It led to a worse viewing experience, and it made season 1 feel far less exciting and action packed than it should have. And before anyone brings this up, no, it being an adaptation of a well known book series that many people have read is not an excuse. Because, first of all, not every viewer of the show has read the books. For at least a small percentage of viewers, this show is their first introduction to the Percy Jackson universe, so the writers shouldn't assume it's okay to just speed through major plot points. Those first time viewers of the show deserve just as amazing of an introduction to the universe as we got when we first picked up these books, and it's a shame that because of the way season 1 was written, those people might have come off with a lackluster impression and not give the show a second chance. Even for viewers who are familiar with the story, the fun comes from following the characters as they solve the mystery. In fact, I'd argue that problem solving and conflict resolution are the main elements that the characters face on a quest, and seeing how they deal with that tells us more about them and how they act under pressure. For that reason, even if the show's viewership consisted 100% of people who have read the books, which it doesn't, I would still say that's a bad faith argument for excusing lazy plot execution. It's okay to write the show in a less interesting way because everybody already knows what happens. No, and in fact, it should be the opposite. So, naturally, the big question going into season 2 was, has the writing improved? Overall, my answer is yes, it has improved in comparison to season 1. There aren't nearly as many exposition dumps to slog through, and the dialogue does a better job of moving along the action instead of grinding it to a halt with explanation. The pacing didn't lose me as frequently, and a lot of the character interactions felt like actual conversations that people would have, instead of the characters just saying information to each other, which was a welcome shift. It plays into suspension of disbelief. I want to be able to watch a scene and not be thinking, oh, these are actors playing characters and the writers wrote that line for them. It's refreshing to be able to sink into a scene. I think there was an effort to include a bit more humor this season. I actually chuckled at this one interaction between Percy and Tantalus in episode 2. You think you're very clever, don't you? Not really, no. Well, neither do I. I enjoyed the line deliveries from both of the actors. It was well done. Hermes definitely gets his flowers this season, regardless of how you feel about Lin-Manuel Miranda as an actor, writer, person. I think he's got that quirky but can be surprisingly serious character down to a T. So the humor works for this interpretation of his character. Notable lines include, "Well, I invented the lyre which some thieves stole, but why harp about it? Get it?" And, "What happens in Vegas is the reason for half the kids in the Hermes cabin." I also like that they let the characters act like kids a little bit. Ooh, sorry, my cat wants out of my room. 1 second. There you go, sweet pea. Bye bye. Okay, where were we? Like Percy and Tyson burping in each other's ears, or Percy and Clarisse bickering over Sea of Monsters strategy before Annabeth has to come in and break them up. Moments like that not only remind us of their age, which I'll keep bringing up throughout the video, it also just makes them feel more human and real. They're kids after all, they're not going to be perfectly behaved all the time. That said, I'd like to see more humor interwoven throughout this story, rather than concentrated in a few moments that stand out. And I might not be as inclined to harp on this point if it weren't for the huge juxtaposition between the book and the show. Granted, Book Percy makes a lot of silly, goofy comments in his inner monologue, so in the show, his dialogue would have to do a lot of the heavy lifting. More on that later. But Annabeth is quite witty herself, and Percy earned the fandom nickname Persassy for a reason. I would have appreciated a tone that leaned more into the persistent presence of humor coming from the characters' personalities and their bonds with each other, rather than moments here and there that were really like exceptions to the rule. With that, if you couldn't tell, we'll be moving into some of my critiques here. I mentioned suspension of disbelief a few minutes ago, and while I enjoyed a lot of the character interactions this season, there are a few elements that detracted from that suspension of disbelief. Something I feel the show lacks is, in a broad sense, consequences of the events that take place, and in an even broader sense, a feeling that a larger world exists beyond what's shown. When I say consequences of actions, I don't mean that there's no logical cause and effect to any of the characters' actions. Of course, they make choices, and those choices affect the story outcome, among other factors. So, in that sense, there are consequences to their actions, positive or negative. What I'm referring to is the general idea that our characters should be affected by the things that happen to them, and so should their environment. Further, the characters' interactions with the world should produce a continuity of consequences that affects how they're treated and perceived. For example, Percy displayed a great deal of bravery in the events of season 1, not to mention he's the son of Poseidon, so all of the other campers should know him. Not all of them like him, but he's notorious. Yet in episode 2, when Percy is escorted to the Poseidon cabin by armed guards, it felt like the other campers were watching him pass just because he was someone being escorted by armed guards, a situation that would draw attention regardless of who it was happening to. It didn't feel like the other campers were watching him pass and thinking, "Whoa, that's Percy Jackson, the kid who saved camp last summer." It's the same thing in the scene where Tantalus approves Clarisse to quest for the fleece. When Percy stands up to say his piece, it didn't really feel like the other campers in the room cared that it was him speaking, even though realistically, that would give his words more legitimacy in some people's eyes, and in other people's eyes, they're tired of him hogging the glory. It would have been great to add some whispers of people chattering as he walked by in the first scene, and people telling him to shut up by name in the second. In the book, little things like that really gave you a sense of Percy's place at camp, especially with how many campers were still willing to make fun of him. I mean, they're kids after all. In the show, it ends up feeling like our main characters are main characters, like their actions take place in a vacuum and don't really affect how other people see or treat them. It doesn't feel like they're part of a wider social network where dynamics and hierarchy ought to be established by past events. I was taken out of the story in those moments because the writing was more focused on pushing the plot forward rather than making sure surrounding characters reacted appropriately to said plot. On that note, without getting too much into plot summary yet, several events take place at camp this season where there's damage to people and property, like significant damage. I would have loved to see the after effects of those conflicts to feel the weight of what happened. I mean, in episode 1, Clarisse literally says there are wounded campers to tend to, yet, A, we don't actually see that happen because the giants who were attacking showed up outside of the camp border, and B, that's never brought up again. In episode 2, the monster birds pretty viciously attack the audience in the stands, and there's even a shot of people limping off the chariot track. Yet, that's never brought up again, and of course, none of the main characters are meaningfully injured. And the season finale, I have a lot to say on that note when we get there, but same point, I just wish the weight of what happened, like, I wish we felt that on a wider scale. Few things are more immersion breaking than when something really significant happens and the story just moves on like it was any other Tuesday. It takes me out of the story because I'm like, this ought to be a bigger deal than it is. It breaks my suspension of disbelief. Off the back of that point, I want to bring up something that has bothered me since the show started. We never see the characters tired or hungry. I know this could seem like the joke that's made about a lot of shows and movies, like, we never see the characters use the bathroom and stuff like that. That's not what this is. My issue is the characters are never as affected as they should be by the circumstances of their hardships and travels. To be clear, this season takes place over the course of like 3 or 4 days. They're constantly on the move, constantly in danger, constantly encountering enemies in literally explosive, quite literally explosive situations. They're more or less on the run and also on a time crunch. So, why then do we have no sense of the toll this takes on them? They never seem to eat, they never really seem to sleep, and neither of those factors seem to cloud their judgment. One of the most realistic parts of the book was the desperation that crept in over time. The characters are tired, dirty, hungry, and that leads to lapses in judgment that cost them. For example, when Clarisse takes them aboard her ship, Percy thinks, I don't really want to eat food made by zombies, but his fear is like just overpowered by how hungry he is. On Circe's island, Percy recognizes that Hyla's behavior matches up with traps they've fallen into before, where someone seems really nice and hospitable at first but is actually out to hurt them. But he's so tired and hungry that he just goes along with it anyway. That's entirely missing from the show. It would have been so interesting to explore how desperate these kids became and how exhausted they were by the energy it took to survive. It's unrealistic for them to make clear headed, logical decisions all the time. And if they're not tired and hungry, then I actually have less reason to understand why they make questionable choices, like trusting Circe. It might seem like a small thing, but I think it removes the sense of burden from the quest. Quests are a great honor for demigods, sure, but they're also a massive undertaking that not everyone comes back from. I wish we got to see the toll that that takes. And I do mean see. The characters never look as disheveled as I feel like they should have, surviving ship explosions, chariot crashes, sword combat, etc. And I'm not asking for them to look malnourished or anything, but why can't they be sweaty or have tears in their clothes? Stuff like that would make it feel like the events of the story affect the characters both physically and emotionally. That's one reason why I appreciated details in the book, like Percy getting multiple supply bags from Hermes, or the group finding more resources at the Virginia Beach hideout. I guess the start of episode 4 implies that Annabeth was going to get those resources, but it didn't seem like she came back with anything. I don't know where these kids are getting food and fresh water. I wish I did. Okay, now we're gonna pivot a little bit. Remember when I discussed the writing in season 1 and I said the fun is watching the characters solve the mystery? And how it's less interesting and less fun when the characters just know things or figure things out without working for it? Well, that was never made clearer to me than in this season with the huge contrast between the show and the book. One of the early mysteries is the meaning of the numbers the Grey sisters recite to Percy in their cab. And at first they seem like random numbers, but Percy knows they must have some significance because one of the sisters accidentally lets slip that they know the location he seeks. And it takes a little while for him to figure out that they're latitude longitude coordinates, but the way that realization is set up is pretty clever. For one, when Percy's going through his school day at the start of the book, he mentions that in social studies class, they're going over latitude longitude maps. It's a really quick sentence that I probably would have missed on first read, but it's like a subtle way of explaining why Percy would be able to put the pieces together in the first place. And those pieces also don't, fall into place until he acquires all of them over a period of time. First, the Grey sisters say the numbers aloud. Then, a little later, Annabeth implies that if Percy's dream with Grover is real, then Grover is alluding to the mythical Golden Fleece, which is impossible because it's been lost for ages, according to her. And then she mentions the Grey sisters again. Only then does Percy realize that the numbers must be coordinates that will lead them both to the Fleece and to Grover. I like that the epiphany comes from pieces of information that he gets gradually, because it makes the end result feel earned and it's a realistic way to come to a conclusion. In the show, I think the realization is clunky or at least highly convenient. Percy hears the numbers not once, but twice. First in the Grey Sisters' cab, and then again in his dream with Grover that night. And in that same dream, Grover literally points up at the fleece and they look at it together. First of all, I don't know why Grover would know the exact coordinates of Polyphemus's island. And second of all, I don't like how heavy handed this is. It's no longer a confusing utterance that Percy has to puzzle out. It's like a piece of information being hammered over his head. And if that weren't bad enough, Percy wakes up from the dream, happens to look at the map above his bed, and just immediately makes the connection that the numbers are coordinates. It cheapens the realization because there's no critical thinking. It's just a series of things that had to happen in order to convey the information to Percy and the viewer. He didn't do any mental work, the information just kind of fell in his lap. Maybe that's a super minor thing, but it's always a pet peeve of mine when things play out super conveniently. Like, of course, the main character dropped the folder and the most important piece of paper just happened to fall out face up. Of course, these, two characters are unnaturally telling each other information for the sake of the main character being able to overhear. Of course, Percy just happens to have a world map right above his bed, and as soon as he looks at it, the lines draw themselves before his eyes. It's just an inherently less interesting way for things to happen. Similarly, in the book, Percy and Annabeth don't yet understand that Luke wants the fleece in order to speed up Kronos' healing process. They only know that he's potentially after it too. And I'll talk about it more in Luke's character section, but one thing I liked about the books is that they kept Luke's motivation largely mysterious until the narrative was ready to unpack the depth of his choices. It makes sense that the main characters don't understand what he's after at first, because he plays with his cards exceedingly close to his chest. He's been planning this revolution for a long time, and he doesn't want people at Camp Half-Blood to figure out his strategy. In the show, while Percy and Annabeth are being held captive aboard the Princess Andromeda, Luke is in the middle of expositing about Kronos' coffin, which is, silly in itself, when Annabeth just randomly guesses what he wants with the fleece and says it aloud to him. It feels unearned, and it doesn't serve the story by adding bigger stakes or rushing the timeline. Or rather, it would theoretically add bigger stakes, but the characters don't act like this new information changes anything. So, what's the point? The only justification for revealing Luke's motivations would be if the writers wanted to really light a fire under the characters and add, a sense of urgency to their cause, but that doesn't happen. Chronologically, you might expect me to address the whole Cersei reveal next. Trust me, we will get to that in the episode 5 discussion. I have thoughts. But for now, here's the last thing I'll say on this topic. I'm going to read a brief excerpt from page 253 of the book, and this is Percy's narration. I tried to think, but I'd always gotten my mythology mixed up. Even now, when it was so real, so important to my own life, I had trouble keeping all the names and facts straight. That passage summarizes what I feel is missing from the show. Percy shouldn't just know things, not only because of his ADHD, but also because he hasn't been part of this world for very long. I mean, strange things have been happening his whole life, but he only found out about the godly world like a year ago. I wish that would have been kept in mind in these early seasons. As the show goes on, he'll learn more and he'll be directly exposed to a lot of it, so it won't be as relevant then. But in season two, it never really felt like Percy was as out of his depth as I'd expect him to be. I really just implore the show, let these kids figure things out on their own. I beg, I plead. Switching gears a little, I want to talk about an interesting element this season. It might have happened a little in season one, but in season two, we really see the show take advantage of the ability to leave Percy's perspective. First person point of view was and still is pretty standard in junior fiction, and it typically brings the reader closer to the narrator. So, in the books, we really got to know Percy and his voice and personality. Those are the upsides of first person, but the downsides are that we're limited to his thoughts and experiences. We can't see things happening outside of his perspective, and it's always possible that his perception of things isn't completely accurate. A lot of screen adaptations take advantage of the visual medium to expand the world a bit and give the viewer more than just the main character's perspective. Take the Hunger Games films, for example. As opposed to the books where we only see and know what Katniss does, in the movies we see some of the behind the scenes of the games, scenes in the Capitol with her family back home, and there are scenes involving other characters where Katniss herself isn't always present. PJO has taken the same approach, and I appreciate that. It gives writers the freedom to mix up the story structure, and it makes scenes more dynamic because not everything has to be filtered through one character's eyes. In this season specifically, the show kind of gives us more of Clarisse and her character development, occasionally leaving our other main characters to follow her and her quest. I'm going to discuss that more in her character section, but it is a promising direction to take the story. Together with the Thalia flashbacks, I'm hopeful that the writers will show relevant subplots or past events in future seasons, rather than just having things explained to us. For example, without getting into spoilers, it would be really impactful to actually see Nico and Bianca's history play out. Beyond stuff like that, there are opportunities to add brief scenes that Percy himself isn't around for, but which would enrich our understanding of the world, and it would make it feel more lived in than it does now. Speaking of which, let's talk about the world building. I don't have any huge points I want to make, just some things that I noticed that I want to bring up. During the post chariot camp meeting where Tantalus addresses everyone, I noticed that all of these speaking main characters were wearing monochrome, like multicolored shirts, while all of the extras were wearing the standard orange Camp Half Blood t shirt. In universe, I think it's because, those characters participated in the chariot race and those are the shirts that they wore under their armor. But on a visual design level, it's a clever way to distinguish the main characters from the extras. It's a subtle but effective way to weave world building into visual cues for the audience, and I'd love to see more of that in the future. In the book, during the Polyphemus fight, Percy calls for Attack Plan Macedonia, which refers back to a training course at camp that both Grover and Clarisse are familiar with. It's a nice bit of continuity because we've heard training and tactics mentioned throughout the series, and it's also a good example of how camp prepares demigods to go out into the world. Like I said before, a quest is no small feat, and I like that we see some of that preparation come into play. In the show, it kind of feels like they've been thrown out to sea, haha, and just like expected to swim. And while I'm sure that's true on some level, small details like attack plans would have gone a long way to show that camp is actually preparing these kids to go out into the world. It shows that they have at least some tools. And really, I would have liked to see any of the training mentioned in the book: horseback riding, swordplay, archery, etc. I get that the runtime doesn't really allow for training scenes, but even if those activities were just going on in the background, it would make Camp Half-Blood feel like much more of a real place. The last thing I want to mention is more so about the godly world in general. But towards the end of the book, Chiron and Percy have this exchange on page 252. Celestial bronze, Percy, an immortal weapon. What would happen if you shot this at a human? Nothing, I said. It would pass right through. That is so interesting, and I'd forgotten all about it. Stuff like that just invites curiosity about the lore, and that's something I'd like to see more of in the show. Little crumbs here and there that make you wonder what you don't know. Plus, that piece of lore in particular could have made for some interesting fight scenes. Overall, I'd like more world building details that would make it feel like the world's actually being brought to life. I want to believe these characters have everyday lives and routines, and shared experience they can draw from to confront the obstacles in their path. I want to feel like Percy and I are gradually diving deeper into the mythology together. It comes all the way back to suspension of disbelief. If I've got those details, then you can pull me in 110%, and I'll feel like I'm entering a fully realized world outside of my own. In conclusion, while the writing in season 2 is a marked improvement from season 1, I'd still like to see changes to the interconnectedness of the world and the realism of interactions between the characters and their environment. Going in a very different direction, let's talk about the visuals. I have a pretty significant bone to pick with this season, so we'll save that for the end, and I'm going to cover some of my smaller points first. Now, I did hear complaints and noticed myself that season 1 wasn't color graded very well. It didn't look as vibrant or exciting as a lot of people expected because it's supposed to be a magical world, especially when Percy's first introduced to it. Sure, there are darker themes and the stakes are pretty high, but there are also really beautiful environments and mystical creatures. Plus, we're following the story through the eyes of very young characters who I'd expect to have a more whimsical, emotionally intense experience. I'm not saying it should have been sunshine and rainbows, but I would have loved to see the colors pop more. The environments were really impressive, especially with, the budget and the largely practical approach taken with the sets, but I wish we could have appreciated them to their full extent. There's an ongoing discussion about modern day color grading and how movies and shows just don't look fun anymore. A big example is the first The Devil Wears Prada movie versus the sequel, which may or may not have released by the time this video comes out. Also, the animated Moana movie versus the live action. And while I don't seek to platform the upcoming Harry Potter show in any way, I did see this fantastic Instagram post that got a laugh out of me. With some stories, subdued coloring works because it aligns with the narrative, or it tells us something about the characters, or the reality of their world. I don't think Percy Jackson is one of those stories. Despite how serious the conflicts get, these are adventures being undertaken by young characters who are growing into themselves and discovering their place in the world. I wish the visual editing choices reflected that. I kind of feel the same way about season 2, though it didn't stand out as much. I think the one exception to that is Cersei's Island in episode 5. One of my first impressions was how beautiful and vibrant everything looked, and that was appropriate for the magical setting. That's the impression I wanted to have throughout the rest of the story. Another small moment I wanted to point out is coincidentally in the Sea of Monsters. Things were pretty gloomy for the most part, so maybe that's why this stood out, but as the characters sail towards Charybdis, there's this prolonged tension before anything happens. We see the soldiers pacing up on the deck, while Clarisse, Percy, and Annabeth man the wheel on the inside below deck. These visuals struck me as a beautiful contrast between the gritty, cold above deck and the warmth and safety that the characters felt, or the main characters, I should say, felt below deck. I could almost feel the temperature difference through the screen, and all of that was conveyed through a subtle touch with lighting. Some other things I liked, there are a couple fun transitions. I liked in episode 1 when Percy wakes up from his dream by falling out of bed. It's a pretty common transition, but I think it's just a fun way to switch from dream to reality. And let's be real, falling out of bed is a very Percy thing to do. I also liked in episode 8 when Percy gets struck by lightning and the camera spins as he and Thalia both hit the ground. I think it did a good job of conveying the disorientation of the scene, and it was just visually interesting. In episode 1, I thought the forest visuals at the beginning were quite pretty, and the skeleton was pretty convincing too. I could have lived in this color grading for the rest of the season. Speaking of episode 1, I liked the set design in Percy's bedroom. Even though we don't spend much time there, it's clear that, a lot of care and attention went towards making the space feel lived in. And I believe this is his room and these are his things because there's personality to the decor. It's I kind of feel the same way when animators make super detailed backgrounds for a shot that only lasts a few frames. It's nice to see how much effort goes into something with so little screen time because I know they know that it'll make things feel more real. My final sub point is about Charybdis in the Sea of Monsters. Now, listen, I'm speaking as someone with mild agoraphobia, which is the fear of very large objects. I'm not even going to look up pictures to like put on the screen in this section because just the thought of that is like, ugh. But what I mean is, I expected to be horrified by the Charybdis graphics. And I mean, like she's literally described like this in the book. To quote page 160, an enormous mouth with slimy lips and mossy teeth the size of rowboats. And worse, the teeth had braces, bands of corroded, scummy metal with pieces of fish and driftwood and floating garbage stuck between them. That's horrific, and when Charybdis first came into view, I did feel that terror and repulsion a bit because I'd built it up in my head. But ultimately, I think the visuals are a bit of a letdown, and the lighting plays a huge role in that. I get it being dark, but when it's to the point that I can't really see much of anything, it mutes the effect a bit. It was still a scary scene, but I think that was emphasized by the chaos of the waves and everyone running around, more so than the visuals themselves. Okay, picture this if I can set the scene for you. Lightning flashes illuminate the outline of teeth, with bits of debris cluttered in the area. The ship draws closer, and as the characters stare horrified, we cut to an overhead shot, slowly pulling up from the center of the maw, giving us the full scale of jaws and lips and the water being sucked into the whirlpool. Even the thought of that is like, ooh, it like makes me shiver a little, and that would have been a wondrous display. But hey, maybe they didn't want to go too intense with the CGI. Which brings us to my big point about the visuals of the season, the CGI. I'm going to preface this by saying I don't have a complex understanding of how TV budgets are distributed. I'm not here to pretend that all my asks are within the realm of possibility, as if the producers, had the means to do all of this and just chose not to. I'm here to describe what I think is missing from the show and argue for why the budget should be adjusted if necessary to accommodate those additions in future seasons. I mentioned that a lot of the sets are practical, which is really cool. It tends to be better for immersion when the actors are actually interacting with their environment instead of, looking at a green screen and just faking a reaction to whatever's going to be pasted in during editing. So I'm fully in support of building elaborate sets and employing practical effects where possible. That said, some things are just impossible or, unreasonably difficult to achieve practically, and that's where CGI comes in. I'm equally happy to look at impressive CGI when that's in service of the story. And considering Percy Jackson involves, mythical creatures and magical settings, it's kind of expected that CGI will play a key role in some of the bigger scenes. I'm not saying that the existing CGI is disappointing or poor quality. I actually think they've got a talented team, which is why I think they could have been equally capable, on a skill level at least, of taking things to an even stronger point. A point that would have enriched the viewing experience and properly showcased how unique this world is compared to our own. My biggest complaint this season probably lies with the hippocampi. Like, I get that they probably couldn't afford, a whole sequence of the hippocampi carrying the characters across the water, with the movement and the water physics. But it feels cheap to just show their heads popping up from the water at a distance at the end of episode 6. And, then when the next episode starts, we're at an extreme distance and our characters get dropped off on the dock off screen. I would have liked to at least see the characters dismount or, see the hippocampi close up at any point. They're one of the few friendly mythical creatures throughout the whole series, and they're quite beautiful, not to mention a connection to Poseidon. It could have been a show stopping few seconds, and I'm disappointed we didn't get to see much of them at all. Okay, the rest of this is going to be chronological to the best of my knowledge. In the book, Luke's top dog henchmen are two monstrous twin guards named Agrius and Aureus, humanoid bear creatures armed with claws and javelins. They're a formidable force, and their presence supports the way Luke calls to those who have been wronged by the god's pettiness. They added a certain credibility to Luke's threats and his influence over demigods, and I liked that the book gave a concrete example of why some would be drawn to his cause. In the show, we see in episode 3 that Luke is backed up by Allison, a few other demigods, and some Laestrygonian giants. Agrius and Aureus don't seem to exist, and I think it's a loss. Both visually, because the bear creatures would have looked super menacing and impressive, and also thematically, because it removes a prime example of Luke's convincing rhetoric. Clarisse's undead army is another point that I want to mention. On page 147 of the book, they are described like this. Lining the deck were zombies in gray uniforms, dead soldiers with shimmering faces that only partially covered their skulls, like the ghouls I'd seen in the underworld guarding Hades' palace. Now, I realize that since the show gave speaking roles to far more of the soldiers than in the book, this might have been tricky to maintain across multiple scenes, especially, facial movements for conversations and such. So I'm not saying they should have aimed for an exact recreation, and, the SFX makeup looks pretty good, but I think that ethereal, ghostly quality is missing. Even a slight shimmer or translucent effect, or if we could see, bones here and there, that would have taken it to the next level for me. A couple things with Circe's Island, and these are arguably more superfluous points. One, I thought it was a fun detail in the book when Percy and Annabeth sail into the port and they see boats, ships, and other vessels from different eras, including some flying vehicles. It would have been a subtle bit of foreshadowing and also visually interesting to have, even a few vehicles kind of scattered along the edge of the island. Like, for example, when everyone's looking out the windows of the resort. It's one of the main clues that something's a little off, but it doesn't come into play until later. Granted, we also don't see how Percy and Annabeth take control of the Queen Anne's revenge when they escape, so I don't know, maybe the team wanted as little headache as possible with ships, in which case, fair enough. Another thing that would have looked cool is this book description of Circe on page 172. She had piercing green eyes and she wore a silky black dress with shapes that seemed to move in the fabric. Animal shadows, black upon black, like deer running through a forest at night. Don't get me wrong, I have no idea how to achieve that kind of effect, but that sounds incredible. Little details of Circe's appearance and presentation provided good foreshadowing of her identity in the book, and in the show, it might have made her feel, more magical right up front rather than like a wellness cult leader kind of vibe. Also, in episode 5, the siren sequence is handled quite differently than in the books. I think it's a shame we didn't get to see the dream world the sirens put in Annabeth's head. And I'm talking about the elaborate version that she gets in the book, not like the weird sewer conversation that she gets in the show. We'll get to it later, but for now, my main point is even if they didn't want to go full scale, book vision, we could have met in the middle with something that at least looked appealing. I guess it's because they went a different direction with the sirens in the show, like, where they show your fatal flaw instead of your deepest desire, but still, when the camera cut to a sewer with the three boys just standing there, I cracked up a little, I cannot lie. All right, we're gonna get a little rapid fire with these because I don't just want to make a ton of complaints. Right after the Siren's vision, Percy saves Annabeth in both versions, but in the book, he pulls her underwater in an air bubble to break the influence of the Siren's song. That would have looked cool. And I wish they'd showcased Percy's powers more in general. I don't know if that's a matter of CGI budget or like an actual narrative choice, but I'll talk about that more later. In the book on page 202, Polyphemus' island is described as, quote, a Caribbean postcard. It had green fields and tropical fruit trees and white beaches. So the idea is that the fleece's magic transforms the island beyond what it was before. Whereas in the show, we don't really have the same sense of magical influence. There aren't any water features, notable colors, or diverse plant life. I would have loved a more vibrant landscape, especially because it would support Polyphemus's passionate defense of his home. Also, Polyphemus's sheep are supposed to be the size of hippos, so like we could have had that. I mean, I want sheep the size of hippos, not like to have, but to enjoy with my eyes on TV. I saw people memeing on the fleece's appearance after episode 6 aired, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. Like, on the one hand, it does look like fleece, like real world fleece, so it's realistic in that sense. But on the other hand, I did expect it to look more magical in some way, more shimmery, more aura, something like that. I wasn't convinced this was a super special, precious object, and it definitely didn't look 60 or 70 pounds like it's described in the book. Okay, last thing in this section, and it's pretty minor, but I think the team might be uncertain how to handle centaur animation with a live actor as, the human half. Season 2 cut the scene where Chiron and his brethren rescue the main characters from Luke, but I noticed that in the few scenes Siren, in the few scenes Chiron has, he keeps his arms crossed or his hands gripping his blazer lapels constantly. Even in the flashback scene with Thalia at the end, the most movement we see is him drawing a bow. I wonder if they needed to avoid his human half conflicting with his centaur half, because they couldn't or didn't want to reconcile the mix of live human and animation. I'd have to go back and see if, for example, like the Harry Potter series took the same approach. I'm not saying it's a deal breaker or a bad thing because I imagine the animation is difficult without worrying about body part overlap, but once I noticed it, it just stuck out more. In conclusion, there's a lot to be impressed with when it comes to the visuals for this season, but I would have appreciated more vibrant color grading and as much CGI as financially possible. I know Disney has the money to give the show the budget it needs to go ham on the CGI, and that's what I want to see in future seasons. Please forgive the change in lighting. I am filming at night now. Now that we've got the overarching sections out of the way, let's take a look at the characters in season 2. First, though, I want to make some general statements. Right off the bat, I don't think these kids are bad performers. One of the most unfortunate consequences of this show is that so many people have it in their heads like, oh, these kids don't act, they don't have range, they can't show emotion. And look, it's easy to blame the actors and actresses because they're the face of a project. They do the red carpets, the interviews, the YouTube shows, and they tend to get blamed first for any complaints people have about a movie or a show, especially ones that involve their performance or their character's dialogue. But I think a lot of people don't consider the role that a director plays in whatever performance or line delivery makes the final cut. This doesn't strike me as the kind of show or network that would really let these kids improvise or adjust their performance as they see fit. I'd confidently say they're following, a script to the letter and doing exactly as their director tells them. That includes the director hypothetically telling them to be more restrained with their performances. Editing and sound and all the other stages come in along the way, of course. But as far as the performances go, the ones in the final cut reflect what the director wanted us to receive. For that reason, I really push back against the idea that these kids can't act. They aren't free agents who can play their characters however they choose. They're doing a job, and it's illogical to blame them for how their characters are written. A lot of these characters are written, both in their dialogue and actions, in a way that feels stiff and not at all like the characters we know from the books. So, moving forward, my question is, why won't they let these kids act more? I rarely saw the characters display the range or intensity of emotion that I would expect from the situations they were in. And coming back to suspension of disbelief, it's difficult to remain immersed in the story at that point. It's admirable to, see brave characters who readily face danger, but there are also places in the story where frustration and vulnerability would have been not just understandable, but expected. My next statement is I'm aware this is an adaptation of a book series, and as a result, it's impossible for the show to portray, oh, excuse me, it's impossible for the show to portray each and every character the way each viewer pictured them. My idea of Percy is different from someone else's, their idea is different from a third person's, and so on. We probably all feel differently about how accurate or true to character the show counterparts are. So, all I can talk about is my own interpretation based on my perception of the characters. And, if you think these representations of the characters are perfect down to a T, then that's great, and it's okay if we disagree. Related to that, you will not catch me arguing that a character is worse off because a person of color plays them. Rick Riordan himself said he wants to update the series through the show. After all, the books were published in, the mid-late 2000s. Meanwhile, his Magnus Chase trilogy, which came out in the, mid 2010s, had a wide variety of character representation. Along with his comments, we can assume that he'd include more diverse characters if he was redoing the Percy Jackson universe today. And lo and behold, the show is his chance to do that. So, in terms of racially diverse casting, I'm glad he gets to offer the representation lacking in the original series. And unless I'm forgetting some part of the books where being white was a quintessential part of any of these characters, I support the decision. With that said, let's move into discussing specific characters, and now I will start to bring in points from the book. And you might say, Autumn, you partially looked at the writing on its own merit without constantly referencing the book for comparison. Why can't you do that here? Don't worry, the characters will partially get that treatment too, but I think once we get to the characters, we can't completely ignore the fact that it's an adaptation. In my opinion, when assessing whether a character in an adaptation is well written, a huge factor is, do they capture in essence, if not in a one-to-one representation, the personality of their original book counterpart and the choices that they would make? In other words, does this character feel like Percy Jackson, or could he just be some guy? And that's why, at this point in my analysis, I can't fully separate the TV interpretation of the book characters from the book characters themselves. We'll move from the characters I have the least to say about to the characters that I have more to say about. And just know I don't have solely complaints for this section. I believe some things were done well this season, just as I believe some things could have been executed better. The first character I want to discuss is Thalia, because even though she's integral to the narrative, she isn't actually present on screen that much. And the screen time she does have is an increase from the book, since in Percy's perspective, he's hearing Annabeth tell him about past events, rather than recalling them himself. Like I said earlier, that's one thing I appreciate about the show going outside of Percy's perspective. Even though I didn't think the flashbacks were 100% efficient in runtime and contents, it was a more engaging way for the viewer to learn the information. Most of my commentary involves the way they styled Thalia. I don't think the point was to age her up, so if we're adhering to canon, she's supposed to be 12 years old in the flashbacks. But she looks like she's 20, which makes sense because Tamara Smart, the actress, is 20. Um, it wouldn't have been so obvious if they'd styled her differently, but they put a lot of makeup on her, which I'll come back to later. And she's presented as this like incredibly tough warrior who jumps through third story windows and lands without even rolling. It ages her up a good bit, and it kind of undermines the tragedy of just how young she was when all of this happened to her. She and Luke were on the run for a while before they met Annabeth, so I'd understand her being, more capable and able to handle herself. But the idea that she's so knowledgeable in combat is a little silly to me. At the end of the day, they were all still kids. Visually, she objectively doesn't align with her character description, and I've established I'm not here to complain about race. So, what I mean is, this is her book description in Percy's Dream. To quote page 190, she wore punk style clothes with silver chains on her wrists. She had spiky black hair, dark eyeliner around her stormy blue eyes, and a spray of freckles across her nose. That's unique, and I think it's a shame that they toned down her fashion to something that doesn't necessarily reflect punk style. Oh, and at the end of the book, Percy describes her as wearing a leather jacket with buttons from a bunch of bands I'd never heard of, page 277. Even that little detail would have made her feel more like the Thalia I know. That said, Tamara Smart is a good actress, and I understand they probably cast her because she wouldn't visibly age between seasons. I'll probably have more to say in season 3 when she takes front and center, and it'll be more important to get her personality right. The next character I want to discuss is Grover, who I don't have as much to say about just because he's not really a main character this season. I like that we got to see his nature magic in episode 1, but I'm so sad he doesn't have fake human feet over his hooves. I'd completely forgotten that detail till I started rereading the book, and it might have been logistically tricky, but what a great visual gag, especially if he carried them while running. It would also add some world building since the show doesn't really go in depth about, the mist and how it conceals magic from mortal eyes. Something like fake feet would have been a wordless explanation for how satyrs blend in the mortal world. Really, my only other point is that in the book, Grover's personality was more defined. He cares about the demigods in his charge, but he's also a hyper, highly energized satyr, and that can work to his detriment in stressful situations. That emotionality overall is better displayed in the book. Take this passage on page 74 during one of the dream sequences. Yes, Grover wailed. He thinks I'm a lady Cyclops and he wants to marry me. And then again on the same page, Grover whimpered, I have to go. Hurry. In the show, I think he handles things pretty well, all things considered. Or rather, he plays it more worried than frantic, if that makes sense. There's also another book moment that sticks out to me when Percy watches Polyphemus lift Grover in front of the cave entrance, to boast about the fleece and how secure the surrounding fields are. And that little taste of freedom just out of reach brings Grover to tears. And, it's sad, but what's more, it adds a greater sense of stakes to his rescue, which I do think the show lacks a bit. Yeah, I don't have a ton to say about Grover this season, but in the future, I'd love to see, more personality instead of him just feeling like any main character's best friend. He and Percy have a unique connection, and I just don't think it's communicated very well in the show. Next, I actually want to compliment the show on how they handled Tyson, not just in terms of casting, because I think Daniel Deemer's great in the role, but also in terms of the writing. It wasn't on my mind at first, but rereading the book reminded me of just how developmentally immature his character originally was. Since, he was young for a Cyclops, the equivalent of about a 7 or 8 year old child, according to Percy. A human child, that is. And that comes across in both his dialogue and his behavior, like being super clumsy, having emotional outbursts, and being unaware of his actions in relation to the world around him. That works okay on the page, but like I've seen other people point out, it might have been pretty hard to translate on screen, and if the writers had gone for it, I doubt it would have been easy to watch. I personally wasn't a big fan of how Tyson was written in the movies either, and I think that adaptation definitely leaned more into his cluelessness. So In the show, I was happy they took a more socially awkward approach. It makes a lot of sense because before he met Percy, Tyson lived on the street fending off monsters his whole life. It's reasonable that he wouldn't be attuned to, quote, socially acceptable behavior, and might struggle in aspects of modern everyday life. We see that in like the brief little clips from Percy's school where he's super awkward. I also like that his dialogue aired on the simpler side without sounding unintelligent. He might speak with fewer words or convey a thought in a less complex way, but he clearly understands the world around him and harbors nuanced emotion. This is how the speech of someone lacking verbal socialization might sound, without reaching the point of caricature. It's one of the changes that works for the better and is conducive to a better viewing experience. My one complaint is I don't love how Tyson is used for exposition. He'll, ask about something he doesn't understand, which gives another character the chance to explain. This is prevalent in episode 1 when he and Percy are walking on the streets of New York talking about heritage. And then later when he asks about Thalia's tree, but it happens a few other times throughout the season. It's not as bad as the exposition problem in season 1, but there's always a better way to convey information, like subtle dialogue or environmental clues. It's frustrating when you can tell the only purpose of a conversation is to tell you, the viewer, something. And the writers just couldn't figure out how to do it subtly. For the most part, though, I really like this interpretation of Tyson's character, and I look forward to seeing him in future seasons. Moving on to a character where the length of discussion kind of surprises me, Luke. I probably had the weakest impression of Luke going into this season, and that's really because his movie counterpart stands out more in my memory. I think a lot of people would agree that Luke was one of the best parts of the original movie adaptations. Shout out Jake Abel.
What are you doing? Don't walk on my roof.
As a result, I went into season 2 with pretty neutral feelings towards Luke, but once I reread the book, I ended up more disappointed with the show's portrayal. Uh, I can't help but feel that show Luke is a watered down version of one of the most compelling characters in the series. We're going to get into it in detail, of course, but my primary argument is very simple. The show lets us see too much of Luke. Let me put it into perspective. In the Sea of Monsters book, Luke appears twice. First, in Chapter 9, when he holds Percy, Annabeth, and Tyson captive aboard the Princess Andromeda, and then throughout Chapters 17 and 18, when his army intercepts the group at Miami Beach. That's it. Despite the merit of some of the show's scenes with Luke, I think they should have gone in the same direction. As a character and an antagonist, Luke is compelling precisely because we don't understand his motivations at first, because we're forced to wonder at what he wants. That's a powerful quality in an antagonist. The fact that he's 2 steps ahead at every turn makes him a constant presence, even when he's not physically there. It's the same logic as horror movies where you barely see the killer on screen. The suspense stretches further, and when the killer does appear, it's much more menacing for the characters and rewarding for the viewer. If the big bad is going to show up and involve themselves in the story directly, then it should be the culmination of everything built up beforehand. I knew this would be a problem from episode 1 when the protagonists catch Luke poisoning Thalia's tree. In the book, the fact that no one saw it happen enabled Zeus to banish Chiron and put Tantalus in charge of camp. Even if most people think Luke probably did it, nothing can be proven, and it's pretty menacing to think that he snuck into camp without anyone noticing. Luke showing up so soon removes that ambiguity and makes it seem odd that anyone would question Percy treating him as a threat. When things are straightforward, it takes away from the greater mystery. It's way more fun when you have to figure out what happened along with the characters. And if things played out the way they suspect, then why? I understand the writers wanted to explore Luke's vulnerability, but they could have delved into the nuance of his character while keeping his screen time brief and impactful. He shouldn't have appeared as much, but when he appeared, it should have felt like a punch to the face. He should have been threatening, volatile, dangerously proud. I should have felt his anger towards the gods, his care for Annabeth and Thalia, his pain as a young man who feels betrayed by every system and authority figure meant to protect him. To make a comparison, let's look at the Harry Potter series. Did you know that Draco Malfoy's screen time across the entire film series was just 31 minutes and 45 seconds? Everyone would swear he appeared much more, and that's because his screen time actually counted. He came to life as an antagonist, and each time he appeared, you knew he was about to give the protagonists grief or even pose a direct threat to their lives. The movie Malfoy had the most screen time in was The Half Blood Prince, where he was on screen for about 8 minutes. That movie fleshed out his character and showed his vulnerable side, making him more sympathetic. And that paved the way for his pivotal choice in the Deathly Hallows Part 1, where he doesn't identify Harry in front of other Death Eaters. People who have read the Percy Jackson books, maybe you can see where I'm going with this. Malfoy's arc feels satisfying because the story didn't open up his inner world until the writers were ready for it to pay off. Whether you hate him or enjoy his contribution to the story, you understand his motivation. His character's effect would have been diluted if he was written into more scenes just because he was compelling. For all of Luke's added screen time, I don't think the show was ready for his vulnerability to pay off this season, and most of all, I don't feel his motivations. Or maybe a better way to phrase it is, I'm not convinced by his motivations, even when they're integral to the story. And that brings me to my secondary argument. What's truly missing from this version of Luke is rage. Luke was only 14 when Thalia died, and 19 at the start of The Lightning Thief, aka Season 1. He spent 5 years in an overcrowded cabin of children whose parents never claimed them, seeing firsthand how many demigods were let down by the system. He personally hates his father, Hermes, for abandoning him as he perceives it, which affects his view on all godly parents' relationships with their demigod children. In the show, we don't get a real sense of his rage, or at least not its depth. He doesn't yell, he doesn't lose his grip, he doesn't see red at the merest mention of his father. Instead, show Luke is stoic, contemplative, very calm in explaining his side, and very calm in rebutting theirs. I want to examine specific scenes to show you what I mean. Let's take their first exchange aboard the Princess Andromeda, for example. To quote from page 127 to 128. How could you? Annabeth sounded so angry I thought she'd explode. Thalia saved your life, our lives. How could you dishonor her? I didn't dishonor her, Luke snapped. The gods dishonored her, Annabeth. If Thalia were alive, she'd be on my side. Liar. If you knew what was coming, you'd understand. I understand you want to destroy the camp, she yelled. You're a monster. Skipping a few lines. Traveling with a cyclops, Luke chided. Talk about dishonoring Thalia's memory. I'm surprised at you, Annabeth. You of all people. Stop it, she shouted. I didn't know what Luke was talking about, but Annabeth buried her head in her hands like she was about to cry. Finally, a little later from page 129 to 130, Luke, I cut in. Listen to me. Your father sent us. His face turned the color of pepperoni. Don't even mention him. He told us to take this boat. I thought it was just for a ride, but he sent us here to find you. He told me he won't give up on you no matter how angry you are. Angry? Luke roared. Give up on me? He abandoned me, Percy. I want Olympus destroyed, every throne crushed to rubble. You tell Hermes it's going to happen too. Each time a half-blood joins us, the Olympians grow weaker and we grow stronger. He grows stronger. Luke pointed to the gold sarcophagus. The verbs are important here. Snapped, yelled, shouted, roared. This isn't a chill conversation, it's a manifestation of the tension between two world beliefs and between people who once trusted each other unconditionally. And yet, in the show, these are the vibes.
How'd you learn about this ship? Your dad told me. Oh, good. Hermes should lose hope. His time is over. Life just doesn't do mercy.
That's why you poisoned Thalia's tree to force a quest for the fleece. That's why you destroyed all that's left of your oldest friend.
You didn't know her.
This scene completely takes the bite out of Luke's character. His composure remains pretty calm the whole time, even when Percy brings up his father. I believe he has feelings of anger towards the gods, but that's not conveyed through his conduct, only his words. Luke is the most egregious case of the show's toned down emotion problem because removing his anger undermines our ability to understand the extremity of his actions. One of the best parts about Percy's arc throughout the series is that even though he remains at odds with Luke, he comes to understand Luke and the position he was put in. Percy steadily realizes how flawed the gods are, and the more he learns, the angrier he becomes. It makes Luke a much more compelling villain because you can't hate him. He fell through the cracks, and unlike Percy, he didn't have any safety nets. And even though he is responsible for his own choices, he's also a product of his environment, and you can understand why Luke would go to such drastic lengths to tear down the system that failed him. Presenting show Luke like this, calm, level headed, unbothered, makes it hard to buy into his choice to ally with Kronos and aid his resurrection. In that way, it does detract from how sympathetic he is. Despite Luke's extended screen time, his character didn't move me as much, and I didn't feel terribly sorry for him. The moments meant to give us a glimpse into his psyche didn't land because I didn't believe his hurt was bone deep and years in the making. There's more to talk about, but it involves book to show changes, so I'll save it for later. For now, I'll conclude with this. I don't buy Luke as a character, and that's not Charlie Bushnell's fault. In the season finale, he showed more range than in the whole show so far, so he's got it in him. He just needs to be allowed to exercise it. Sure, it's possible that in the next few years, these actors will go on to participate in other projects and give the exact same delivery in all of them. But unless that happens, I will continue to advocate for the talent I believe they possess. And if the show doesn't give me reason to believe that Luke is as capable, threatening, and unhinged as the plot requires, then he won't work as a primary antagonist for the next 3 seasons. Alright, next up, Clarisse. It took a couple episodes to figure out what was bothering me with Clarisse in this adaptation, but my main theory is this. The show is so focused on catering to a wide audience that the decision makers above Rick Riordan's head won't allow a masculine presenting female character to be emotionally complex. Let's look at the way Clarisse is described in the book. On page 41, quote, "She was a big girl with cruel eyes like her father's. She looked like she was born to wear Greek battle armor, but I didn't see how even she could stand against that bull's charge." Here, Percy is observing Clarisse's appearance as she leads the charge against 2 bronze bulls, and even though he has every reason to speak poorly of her, he instead acknowledges she's an asset in battle because of her impressive build. This is not a critique of Dior Goodjohn and her acting capabilities, and it's also not a critique of her physical appearance. I think she's gorgeous and she seems very physically fit and toned. That said, with the emphasis that the overall casting has taken on increased diversity, it's disappointing that they removed existing representation in terms of body type and gender presentation. Clarisse was a decent character for the mid 2000s, even through Percy's eyes. He can't stand her, but he's not like, look at this Uggo, she's too big and muscly for a girl. And I would actually argue the show leaned into that more with her making a move on Chris Rodriguez and getting rejected outright. In the passage I read, Percy acknowledges her capabilities and respects her fighting prowess. In general, she's presented as headstrong, physically intimidating, a powerhouse presence. So the show taking a more conventionally feminine approach does feel like a misrepresentation because it erases what distinguishes her from other female characters. Most of them are pretty formidable fighters, but she's a tank. That makes her, a bigger obstacle for Percy when they disagree, and a major asset in battle when they inevitably end up on the same side. Interestingly, Season 2 gives Clarisse more emotional nuance and complexity than she gets at this point in the books. She navigates a complex relationship with Ares and grapples with the weight of the quest. We see her uncertainty towards commanding an undead crew, and she gets vulnerable with Percy in a conversation before they face the Sea of Monsters. I haven't figured out exactly how I feel about the change, but in general, it's interesting to give a side character a more prominent role in the story. However, I can't help but wonder if the writers felt they could pull that off because the actress is conventionally attractive. I also can't help but wonder that if they had cast an actress who physically matched Clarice's book description, would they still have centered her more in the story and painted her with dimension? Or would Hollywood societal convention have prevented us from seeing a bigger masculine girl as a well rounded character? And I've seen people bring up a fair point that it'd be tough to cast a young actress under the pretense of her being conventionally unattractive. But I think there'd be a way to avoid insulting the actress while giving young girls a physical role model on screen. There are plenty of traits and characteristics in female characters that aren't often represented in media. Some examples are wider rib cages, broader shoulders, square or rectangular body shapes. These features aren't inherently unattractive, they're just not as visible in mainstream media. I've even seen influencers show, for example, their wider rib cage to try to normalize it, and they'll get comments like, "You don't have a wide rib cage, you're just fat." I'm not going to pull examples because I don't want to invite commentary about those creators' bodies. I mention this to emphasize that these characteristics seriously lack representation in any kind of media. The show had a great opportunity to present a character with those physical traits who wasn't just a "I'm so tough, I'm not afraid of anything" girl. I don't necessarily mind exploring Clarice's vulnerability. I just wish the writers had given that same nuance and complexity to a character who didn't fit the mainstream mold of femininity and girlhood. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments. Let's just keep discussion civil. That's my big point out of the way, so now I'll get to some of my smaller thoughts. There are some differences in Clarice's personality from book to show. For one, in the book, even though she's ruthless, she still expresses care for the people in her charge and camp as a whole. I'll give you some examples. After the Bronze Bulls fight, Clarisse confronts Percy and Annabeth, claiming she had everything under control. And the following exchange takes place on page 44. "Clarisse," Annabeth said, "you've got wounded campers." That sobered her up. Even Clarisse cared about the soldiers under her command. "I'll be back," she growled, then trudged off to assess the damage. Then, when Tantalus announces that the chariot races are back on, Clarisse expresses concern for camp security, even though it means standing up to an authority figure. When Tantalus makes a big deal about her being the great hero who will save camp, she, quote, shifted uncomfortably, like even she didn't want glory at the price of being Tantalus's pet. These moments characterize her as a leader in more than one sense. She can command a group of people, but she also takes responsibility for those in her charge. She's proud and headstrong, but she cares deeply for her community and takes pride in it. In the show, it doesn't seem like she has a relationship with anyone else at camp, and that might be the lack of group scenes, but I didn't get the sense that she feels strongly about the good of the camp or responsible for other campers. In fact, when the monster birds attack camp, Clarice delights in the chaos and surges forward to win the chariot race uncontested rather than stopping to help right away. It makes it hard to believe how much she cares about her undead crew later, expressing this sense of duty and obligation when she didn't seem to feel that way about her fellow campers. When she and Grover are stuck in Polyphemus's cave and she says she deserves to get eaten because she didn't protect her crew, that didn't really match with previous behavior. It gets even tougher when she's adamant on not giving Luke the fleece, even if it means Annabeth dies. She changes her tune in episode 7, but if the show wanted me to believe, even for a moment, that Clarisse would prioritize camp over someone she knows, then the writer should have set up her devotion to camp from the beginning. Along similar lines, Clarice's vulnerability included fear responses where there were none in the book, but in this case, I think the change is good. It makes sense for Clarisse to face other demigods head on, but be more cautious with the Sea of Monsters or a mature Cyclops. It'd be difficult to take her seriously if she reacted to every threat with the same bravado. I also appreciate that the show dropped her bullheadedness with the Polyphemus scenes. The most infuriating part of her character in the books was her need to be right or triumphant to a fault. Like when she just had to correct Polyphemus when he called Grover a cyclops, blowing Grover's cover, or when they were almost home free for the island, but she just had to taunt Polyphemus and he used the sound of her voice to throw a boulder that sunk their boat. Kind of like Tyson's immaturity, that bordered on caricature, and it made Clarisse less likable than she already was. So I commend the show for removing that because, similar to the direction they took with Tyson's writing, I think it led to a better viewing experience. And speaking of Tyson, really quickly, were we just gonna brush over how Clarisse wanted to kill him in the beginning? Like, she was basically salivating for the chance, and I don't have a lot to say about it. It was just an off putting intro to her character for the season. My last note is that Book Clarisse had more initiative going into the quest because we find out she prayed to Ares for naval transport. So, him supplying her with a ship and a crew of undead soldiers was his response, and the crew are compliant because they want to escape eternal damnation. In the show, it's more like Ares shows up as she's setting off and offers everything without being asked, with the tone of, I'm doing all of this for you, so you'd better not fail me. That angle works too because it puts her in a desperate position to succeed on the quest, but I also like her taking charge as the daughter of Ares. She tells Percy this like she's a hotshot for having Ares' help, and that's later undermined when Percy overhears Ares yelling at her. Both approaches add mystery to the father daughter dynamic, they're just two different takes. Though I will say, when it comes to the show, I'm not convinced the undead soldiers would disregard her command like that. I get the writers wanted, a rallying speech to the troops moment, but Ares is the god of war, and he told them to follow her orders. But yeah, those are my thoughts. I think Clarisse has a lot of promise if the writers keep giving her a bigger role in the story, and if they smooth out the inconsistencies. Still, I can't help but suspect she gets a bigger role because she's not as masculine as she was in the books and is conventionally attractive. Dior Goodjohn is an incredible actress, and she doesn't deserve any hate or personal criticism. I just hope that sometime soon in mainstream media, doors open for diverse body representation and lesser represented traits in female characters, because unfortunately, with this show, the door was closed from the start. Now, before we move on to the next character, I want to talk about the show's choice to give the female characters a full face of makeup. I'm not a film expert, but I understand why makeup is helpful on set. It makes skin smoother and even toned on camera, and I appreciate it. If camera lights were shining off the characters' foreheads in every scene, I'd be pretty distracted. But you know what else is distracting? When Clarisse washes up on the shore after surviving a shipwreck looking like this. Or when Annabeth looks like this after several days on the run with minimal sleep and not a change of clothes in sight. Or when Allison returns from yeeting herself overboard into the ocean looking like this. And, to be fair, who cares about Allison? But Clarisse and Annabeth are the last people you'd catch wearing makeup. It's difficult to suspend my disbelief, especially because these characters are supposed to be young. I believe Annabeth is 13 and Clarisse is 14 or 15, 16 at most. Giving them a full face of makeup is a surprising choice. You'd think production would want to make them look younger, not more mature. Leah Savage Jeffries is only 16, so she's pretty young, but she is visibly older from season 1, and Dior Goodjohn is 19, turning 20 this August. I wish the show would give them minimal makeup to accurately reflect how their characters would present themselves. There are ways to apply logistically necessary makeup without making it so obvious. It's another frustrating reminder of how feminine conventions are pushed in mainstream media, even when it goes against the core of their characters. I'd love to hear if you noticed this or if it didn't really bother you. It wasn't on my mind when I started the season, but in the first couple scenes with Annabeth and Clarisse, it was obvious how much makeup they had on, and I couldn't help but notice how their makeup and hair stayed intact through everything that happened. It's one of those details that seems ridiculous for the circumstances, and it makes me think I'm watching a show. With that, the next character I want to talk about is Annabeth. I really like Leah Savage Jeffries. I love the interviews with her, Walker, and Arian where She gets to show her personality and be more emotive. She really showcases why she was cast as Annabeth in real life, not in the show. This might come off strong, but I resent the way this show has robbed the main trio of their personalities. The writers focused so much on the exposition problem and writing the show better that they didn't have time to write three-dimensional characters. In the show, other characters call Annabeth smart and comment on her capabilities, but I hate to say it, this Annabeth feels like a pretty average supporting character. I don't get a sense of how badly she wants to absorb knowledge, of her deep running pride, of how formidable she is as a result of the situation she's had to survive. I'm going to read some excerpts from the book. So, first, page 27, Annabeth speaking after the Laestrygonian attack at Percy's school. Quote, "Something's wrong. We have to get there right away. Monsters have been chasing me all the way from Virginia trying to stop me." In those two sentences, we understand that Annabeth made her way up several hundred miles of coastline, fending off monster attacks on her own. She's 13. Then we have the backstory of why Annabeth doesn't like Cyclops. So from page 188 to 189. The Cyclops was starting a fire in the middle of the floor. I drew my knife, but he heard me. He turned and smiled. He spoke, and somehow he knew my dad's voice. I guess he just plucked it out of my mind. He said, "Now, Annabeth, don't you worry. I love you. You can stay here with me. You can stay forever." I shivered. The way she told it, even now, 6 years later, freaked me out worse than any ghost story I'd ever heard. "What did you do?" "I stabbed him in the foot." I stared at her. "Are you kidding? You were 7 years old and you stabbed a grown Cyclops in the foot?" "Oh, he would have killed me, but I surprised him. It gave me just enough time to run to Thalia and cut the ropes on her hands. She took it from there." "Yeah, but still, that was pretty brave, Annabeth." She shook her head. "We barely got out alive. I still have nightmares, Percy. The way that Cyclops talked in my father's voice. It was his fault we took so long getting to camp. All the monsters who'd been chasing us had time to catch up. That's really why Thalia died. If it hadn't been for that Cyclops, she'd still be alive today." That all speaks to the grit that she was forced to develop as a child, and it also adds nuance to her feelings about Cyclops. Um, in the show, the writers sprinkle foreshadowing in a few scenes, but it's not played as strongly, so she just seems kind of mean. This wouldn't bother me as much if it weren't for the show's emphasis on Annabeth being a hardened demigod. At the end of episode 2, she tells Percy, quote, "That's the difference between me and you. You can be a demigod and you can go home to your mom and just be a kid. Me, I just know how to be a demigod." But we don't feel that. In episode 1, she shows up in Manhattan in the Grey Sisters' cab, leaving out any hardship she faced along the way. When she and Percy confront Allison in episode 3, Annabeth doesn't best her in combat. She just moves out of the way and Allison throws herself overboard. Most of all, the show completely changes how things went down with Thalia, Luke, and the Cyclops. In the show, Annabeth leaves the group to go back and find a bracelet she dropped, and on the way, a group of Cyclops captures her, which prompts Luke and Thalia to come rescue her. The detour to save her slowed them down long enough for the Furies to catch up close to camp. I understand the show wanting to paint Annabeth feeling indebted to Thalia and probably suffering from survivor's guilt, but I think it's the simpler, less interesting route. For 7-year-old Annabeth to hear the Cyclops speak in her father's voice and still be brave enough to stab it is a fantastic display of resilience that shouldn't have been taken from her character. Instead, the show relegates Annabeth to a passive role, someone who needed to be saved. Taking away moments where we get to see her strength and survival instinct adds up to her not feeling formidable or capable. Considering everything these characters are about to go through, that's not a good impression to have. In any case, the season failed to demonstrate Annabeth's aptitude as a fighter and undermine her experience with monsters. But hey, Since we don't really see that part of her backstory in the show, what can I say? To pull a page out of the Stranger Things book, maybe it happened off screen. My next point is let the girl cry. Show Annabeth spends a lot of the season looking troubled and conflicted, but those emotions never escalate. She's more exasperated than frustrated, more alarmed than scared. She doesn't display extreme emotion even when it'd be called for. I've seen people call it bad acting, but I don't think we can blame Leah Savad Jeffries. Like I said, if the director wanted a stronger, more intense performance, they would have asked for one. And because they didn't, Annabeth feels flattened. Her degree of emotion rarely matches the stakes of a given situation. Maybe that comes back to the show's failure to show how tired these kids would be, but I feel like Annabeth wasn't allowed to have mood swings or occasionally display immature behavior that would be accurate for a 13-year-old girl, demigod or not. Additionally, the show is missing Annabeth's rage and protectiveness. The book perfectly captures her and Percy's relationship when she punches Matt Sloan in the face for bullying Percy. Her and Percy find each other annoying sometimes, but they care about each other and they won't tolerate other people's antagonizing. This doesn't translate in the show because Percy barely interacts with anyone and Annabeth doesn't really stand up for him at any point. My final critique involves Annabeth's relationship with other characters. I don't think the writers are doing justice to the complexity of her relationship dynamics. For one, Annabeth's relationship with Chiron. In the books, she feels very close to him. To quote from page 51, Annabeth ran up and hugged him. Chiron, what's happening? You're not leaving? Her voice was shaky. Chiron was like a second father to her. We don't get that in the show. We don't get scenes that emphasize their history or Chiron's fatherly behavior towards her and why that's important. She's supposed to have been at camp longer than most and at least longer than everyone in the Athena cabin. She should have the relationships to prove that. And despite having no established closeness with Chiron, she goes behind Percy's back at his request, hiding the prophecy and sabotaging him in the chariot race. It takes away from Annabeth's loyalty and righteousness, same as her punching Matt Sloan. Side note, I would think Chiron would know better than to try to influence the course of the great prophecy. Surely he could have predicted that by trying to orchestrate Percy staying at camp, he'd inevitably play into the prophecy's path. But that's just a small thought. Next, I want to address Annabeth's relationship with Thalia. In the book, Annabeth is certain she knows Thalia's heart. Luke argues that Thalia would agree with him and that Annabeth could fulfill her dreams once he overturns the world order. But Annabeth sticks to her morals, and after they escape, she tells Percy that Luke was wrong about Thalia. She would never turn against Olympus. In the show, Luke's argument is much weaker, yet it plants a seed of doubt over Thalia's loyalties. It makes Annabeth seem more malleable to his opinion, which does a disservice to A, the headstrong nature of her character, and B, the connection she and Thalia shared. This is the problem with the show emphasizing Annabeth traveled with Thalia and Luke for only 2 months, as if that's too short for a bond to develop. I also think Annabeth being so affected by Luke doesn't work in this adaptation because she saw Luke betray Percy. In the books, she kept trying to see the best in Luke because she has lingering feelings of admiration for him, and she didn't witness him attempt to kill Percy, leaving her with doubt that clouds her judgment. In the show, I feel some of the history between Luke and Annabeth and their interactions, but that doesn't change the fact that in season 1, she watched Luke draw his sword on Percy and she herself intervened. That ought to make things pretty black and white for her, and yet she's swayed by Luke more in the show than in the book. It doesn't add up. And to be fair, I also want to address some of the things I enjoyed about Annabeth this season. I really want to commend her nobody scene on Polyphemus's island. Leah Savard Jeffries brings great intensity with her facial expressions and line deliveries, and it feels like she has the gravitas to throw Polyphemus off. I also like the moment where Luke arrives and he looks up at Polyphemus swinging at an invisible enemy, and you can see on his face he knows it's her. It's one of the few times I bought into their dynamic and the idea that someone else perceived her as capable. I liked Annabeth feeling overwhelmed by the human unpredictability of choices, futilely hoping she can stay 6 steps ahead. Given the show's backstory of what happened with the Cyclops, it makes sense that, she'd overanalyze the possible outcomes of a choice. I like the angle that Annabeth took with Cersei, stating she can't stand the thought of anyone trying to take Percy away from his mother. It reinforces the idea that, unlike her, Percy had a childhood, and it juxtaposes the natural, loving relationship between Percy and Sally against the artificial, power based relationship between Cersei and the residents of her island. I hope I've sufficiently explained my points. I'm not saying show Annabeth is entirely flat, and there's room for her to continue developing. I just hope the writers don't lose sight of what made her so attaching as a character. Annabeth is a critical thinker, a formidable strategist, and a deeply loyal friend, but she also falls victim to her pride and she struggles with relationships in a way she hasn't been able to voice yet. I hope the writers don't think that complexity and nuance are inherently at odds with a show centered around children. At last, we come to one of the most iconic protagonists in all of YA media, Percy Jackson himself. The boy, the myth, the legend. Except, is he? I like Walker Scobell as an actor, and there's real potential with his version of Percy. I think he has what it takes to portray that sassy and humorous yet loyal and sympathetic personality. As of right now, though, I believe the show's version of Percy Jackson could be any random boy. Book Percy is written with a signature sarcastic humor, and he cares intensely about his loved ones, to the point that he'd choose them over the world. For the time being, he's still enmeshed in his childhood, but as he gets older, we see a volatile side emerge, especially in moments of danger. That might sound generic, but it's how those traits manifest that make him a unique character. Percy's narration is a huge draw of the original series, and probably why the multiple POVs in Heroes of Olympus were so polarizing. In the book, a lot of his personality and emotion is conveyed through inner monologue, but in a visual adaptation, you have to get creative. The viewer has to learn about a character solely through what can be shown on screen facial expressions, body language, etc. It tends to be more subtle rather than the protagonist directly stating things about themselves or others. I think the show has largely failed to do this with Percy because there's no subtlety to his character. When things are outright stated, when he doesn't have to figure things out on his own, the viewer can't learn about his thought process and they don't have to put in effort to piece together his worldview and relationships. We don't get to learn about Percy little by little. In fact, we don't learn much about him at all. I think Walker Scobell was a solid casting choice, especially given the way he behaves in interviews and other public appearances. He gets into plenty of hijinks with Aryan Samadri and Leah Savage Jeffries, and from the Atom Project, it's clear he has the chops to play a sassy, sharp-tongued kid with heart. The problem is, the writing of his character doesn't utilize his potential as a performer. Percy doesn't get to express himself. He goes around trying to solve problems, but we don't get emotion out of him. There are a few scenes that are well done, and Scobell has received a lot of praise for them, but they shouldn't be the exception. We should feel Percy's presence and personality every moment he's on screen, not just when he's in grave distress. The problem, same as all the other characters, is the dialogue. Instead of a humorous, compassionate boy striving to save a friend and his second home, we get a pretty average guy who doesn't seem to have much of a sense of humor. There are one or two humorous moments this season, but no humorous tone, and that's a big part of the reason why I struggle to stay invested. If the dialogue is always serious, it flattens the pacing and removes a core part of Percy's character. I had an interesting thought about how the writers could have approached this. What if they'd occasionally made Percy's inner monologue into audible narration? Think about it. Both seasons have opened with Percy speaking to the viewer, so that wall isn't 100% up. It wouldn't need to be constant, but I think an inner monologue would have taken some of the burden off the exposition problem. Percy could think quips and sarcastic comments to himself, and we could hear him put pieces together or provide info he knows about a given situation or person. It'd be more natural than characters stating information aloud to each other, and we'd probably feel more connected to him as a protagonist. I'd love to hear what you think about that idea. Obviously, it's not something the writers would add after the fact, but in this timeline, there are ways to imbue more personality into Percy's writing. In future seasons, I want to see the writers tighten the dialogue and be more intentional, lean into the show don't tell rule. I want a consistent undercurrent of humor, not taking away from the seriousness, but giving us a window into the characters and the fact that they're still children. Another big reason Percy doesn't feel like Percy is he doesn't feel like a son of Poseidon. I felt it briefly in episode 4 when he tried to control the sea of monsters to save the ship, and I appreciate that they kept Percy's nautical knowledge. But in the rest of the series, I struggled to feel like he carried that distinct lineage. For example, in the books, Percy can speak to equine creatures. It's a small thing, but specific to children of Poseidon. In the show, we don't see him communicate with an equine until the last couple episodes where he encounters Blackjack. However, unlike in the book, the viewer isn't privy to the words being exchanged. I think it's a strange choice not to subtitle them, and a bad choice to make this Percy's only equine interaction in the whole show. Similarly, in the book, Percy and Tyson can speak to each other in their minds. Percy's never experienced such a connection, and it warms him to Tyson and starts cementing their brotherhood. I wish the show had included it. The biggest thing, though, is that Percy doesn't use his powers much. The Sea of Monsters scene in episode 4 gets a pass, obviously, and so does the scene in episode 5 when he makes the water swirl in the hamster cage. But unless I'm forgetting something, that's it. I'll save this discussion for the next section, though, because most of the circumstances surrounding his lack of powers involve book to show changes. For now, I'll say this. I didn't fall in love with this story because it involves a scrappy, everyday boy who uses his wit and street smarts to overcome obstacles. I fell in love with this story because Percy is up against a Titan god, and Rick Riordan wasn't afraid to let him skill max to rise to the occasion. I won't spoil just how OP Percy becomes, but I want to feel the strength of this unique power that he possesses, how others come to both respect and fear it. Anyway, that's my main point. Now I want to talk about Percy's relationship with Luke. I don't think season 1 did a great job establishing their friendship. We didn't see Percy and Luke bond, we didn't see them train together, or have a conversation that wasn't just Luke telling Percy a bunch of information. It didn't feel like they knew each other, so Luke's betrayal didn't hit nearly as hard as it should have. And now that's bleeding over into the writing quality of season 2. Percy coming face to face with Luke didn't feel like confronting a former friend after a murder attempt. He was calm, indignant even. Whereas in the book, Percy approaches the reunion pretty hesitantly. To quote page 126, I'd imagined meeting Luke again many times since he'd tried to kill me last summer. I'd pictured myself boldly standing up to him, challenging him to a duel. But now that we were face to face, I could barely stop my hands from shaking. Percy's calmness in the show is another consequence of the writers refusing to let Luke be as unhinged and terrifying as he is in the books, where he left Percy to die in a pit of scorpions. Regardless, though, the reunion should have been magnetic, but instead it felt like all the other 500 conversations this season. Another thing missing from the show is the idea that Percy and Luke are two sides of the same coin. I know in the show that line refers to him and Thalia, but without spoilers, the comparison that ends up mattering is him and Luke. To quote page 69, swordplay had always been my strength. People said I was better at it than any camper in the last 100 years, except maybe Luke. People always compared me to Luke. In the show, Percy doesn't interact with people around him. We have no idea how campers feel about him or him in relation to Luke, which will undermine certain themes in the future. The writers are going for some nuance, but they haven't included anything on screen to set up this comparison. One last point. Percy suggesting to kill Luke is crazy. In episode 3, when they're brainstorming a plan to reach Luke aboard Princess Andromeda, Percy soft launches the idea of killing him to end the war. Annabeth warns him he's playing into the Great Prophecy in a bad way, but Percy insists Luke can't be saved. I would understand the sentiment of like, he's too dangerous to be reasoned with, but that's not what Percy's saying. He's saying Luke doesn't get a shot at trial or fair judgment. He's too dangerous to be left alive. And that, to me, feels like jumping the gun. I know we'll all enjoy seeing a darker side of Percy later on because it's an impactful part of his character, but same with Luke's sympathetic arc, the show isn't ready for that to pay off yet. I honestly think the show has kind of bungled the relationship dynamics, and that's going to cause problems in future seasons too. Percy gets the worst of it because He's participating in character interactions without any of the traits, behaviors, etc. that make him Percy. And without that, the core of this show doesn't work. I also want to address Percabeth, the relationship pairing between Percy and Annabeth, and I'm not going to give specific spoilers, so show only viewers, you're good to watch this section. Readers absolutely adore Percabeth, and unlike a lot of fandoms, I would say most readers support Percabeth over other ships. Don't get me wrong, other pairings exist in the fandom, but this much of a majority is pretty rare. Naturally, viewers were curious how the show would handle the relationship development. Would they stick to the original slow burn, or would they lean into the romance to try and appease fans? While the show didn't overdo the romantic foreshadowing in season 1, I think they got Percy and Annabeth to trust each other without much setup. They don't have a lot of personal bonding moments, which is another casualty of the exposition problem. They're usually too busy, explaining stuff to each other or conveniently overcoming obstacles. They grew closer because the plot said so, not because there were authentic moments of building trust. Those issues carry over to my opinion of their friendship in season 2. It's not that their interactions are poorly written. I actually buy into their dynamic a bit more this season than the last, but their moments in season 2 don't feel like a realistic progression, and here the romantic foreshadowing does end up feeling forced. Episode 1 gets the worst of it, starting with the Grey Sisters taxi scene. Before they even get in, Tyson commits a social blunder by going, "Oh, you're Annabeth," and then looking at Percy and saying, "You look at her picture all the time, right?" Like, haha, very funny. Then, during the cab ride, one of the Grey Sisters says, "So, this is your boyfriend, huh? No wonder you dream about him." And Annabeth is super adamant she didn't say boyfriend. That feels pretty heavy handed. As far as I can remember, in season 1, none of the other campers teased Percy and Annabeth about going on the quest together. So to start season 2 on that note feels so overt. It's like the show going, "Okay, guys, look out for Percabeth starting now." Also, in episode 1, there's a contrived conflict where they're both upset at each other for not making more effort to reach out during the school year. "Why didn't you use a drachma to call? Why didn't you?" It felt childish in a way that didn't justify itself. Them being at odds in this moment doesn't make sense because they just ran for their lives and had their concerns undermined by the only adults in the situation. I wish they faced the problem together before the conflict of Annabeth having to lie about the prophecy. I also wish the show had stuck with the valid conflict of Annabeth not wanting to come inside the cabin because of Tyson. It's one of the few instances of the writers laying groundwork with subtlety, and they should have let the moment speak for itself. Lastly, I want to make a point about unearned intensity. In episode 4, Percy references the first quest they went on together, and he says, quote, "It only took me 2 days to see how special you were." Then in episode 5, he tells her, "If I had to choose between saving you or saving Olympus, Annabeth, I'd burn it all down." Except season 1 didn't lay the groundwork for any of those statements. Percy and Annabeth completed the quest together, but we didn't see Annabeth use her skills to solve a problem or get out of a particular situation. We didn't see her intellect shine by solving a mystery or see her gain Percy's trust through choices that highlighted her best traits. Any time they refer to this super close relationship they're supposed to have, it feels super intense and unearned. You might be wondering, okay, Autumn, what would you have preferred to see? My answer is simple because the book did it just fine. In the book, there is some teasing about a potential relationship, but it's much more natural because it comes from a kid their age. Percy's school bully gets a hold of the picture of Annabeth that he keeps, and to quote page 13, Sloane checked out the picture and his eyes got wide. "No way, Jackson. Who is that? She is not your..." And then his dialogue gets cut off by something else. So even though there's a strong implication, no one actually says boyfriend or girlfriend. The reader gets to fill in the blank. It's a lot more believable that a teenage bully would have something to say about a potential relationship rather than a millennia old Grey sister, and it's one reason I really wish the show had spent time in Percy's school and everyday life. The book doesn't approach their friendship with intensity and instead establishes his respect for her intelligence and capabilities. To quote page 12, "I wished Annabeth were here. She'd know what to make of my dream. I'd never admit it to her, but she was smarter than me, even if she was annoying sometimes. That's a nice sentiment, and even though you can see how it might lead to romantic interest down the line, right now it emphasizes how much he trusts her judgment and appreciates her company in general. Another thing the book captures is awkwardness, especially on Cersei's island. There's the obvious bit about Percy realizing how nice Annabeth looks, in makeup and pretty clothes, even though it doesn't quite feel right because it's not her. But a smaller moment happens once the pirates chase Cersei off and they have a moment to themselves. Percy tries to apologize for not seeing the signs that Cersei was evil, but Annabeth just hugs him and says, "I'm glad you're not a guinea pig," which makes him blush. That's way more realistic and reasonable for the point they're at in their friendship, not to mention their ages. In the show, Percy and Annabeth navigate closeness so comfortably when, in reality, it is confusing to be 13 and realize how much you care about someone. So, to answer the question of how I'd approach Percabeth in season 2, with age appropriate awkwardness and a long term view of building the groundwork of their relationship. I would not make them super confident 13-year-olds who say deep and articulate stuff to each other. My last point involves Luke. In the book, when they reach the Virginia Beach hideout, Percy identifies that he feels jealous when Annabeth mentions she, Thalia, and Luke made the hideout together. It's 2 or 3 lines and he doesn't dwell on it, but it leaves room for interpretation and humanizes him as a 13-year-old, without making him seem like a jerk for acting on those feelings. In the show, Percy and Tyson don't accompany Annabeth to the hideout, so we don't see how Percy feels about the fact that this place ties Annabeth to Luke. He doesn't seem to feel anything about it if he's even aware. So later, when Percy reacts negatively to Annabeth talking to Luke via iris message and to her telling him about the fleece's power to resurrect Thalia, it doesn't come across as jealousy. It just seems like a logical response to those counterintuitive choices. For one, the Iris conversation apparently clued Luke into their location, so that was a bad call, and I get Percy being upset about the fleece thing because she gave a huge piece of information to the enemy. And then, when Annabeth's excited about Thalia's return and Percy gets pensive, it feels unfounded. He hasn't shown any complex feelings about the time she spent with her friends, so this sudden moody response doesn't make sense. It could have been an interesting dynamic, but the show kind of bungled the execution, and we don't get the same amount of nuance and complexity. I just want their relationship to be written better. Their fierce loyalty becomes super important both in the near future and later down the line. I want to see the writers turn it around and make it feel like actual progression, rather than like they went from 0 to 100 with no on screen interactions to justify that leap. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say on the matter. Now that we've covered the main characters, I want to discuss the minor characters back to back. First up is Allison, arguably the season's most useless character who didn't exist in the books. Someone on Reddit made an interesting point that she might be a plot prop, like specifically, she's the stand in Kronos follower who enacts violence against the protagonists, while Luke gets to be the reasonable, restrained leader. That aligns with the sympathetic angle the show's trying to take, but if he isn't aggressive, then someone has to be. Enter Allison, whose whole personality is follow Kronos' orders. I've already explained why Luke's role this season doesn't work, but I wonder if part of that is because Allison funneled away his harder choices. He can remain uncertain riding the fence, while her choices are uncomplicated by a history with the main characters. Allison just doesn't work for me, and to be fair, I don't think the writers put much thought into her. If she plays a more prominent role in future seasons, I doubt it'll work with how flatly she's been established, and if she disappears because she got such a poor reception, that'll be pretty funny. We'll see which way the show decides to go. Next up is Mr. D, aka Dionysus, and really my only note is that his cruelty was more overt in the book. He delights in teasing Tantalus, goading him into trying to eat and drink even though he can't. Mr. D gets a lot of joy from his failure to relieve his suffering. The show kind of goes for a similar thing where Mr. D summons a bucket of popcorn and starts eating it in front of Tantalus, but cruel is not the word that comes to mind. The show version of Mr. D is just this sardonic, like slightly off his rocker guy who doesn't feel like a vindictive god the campers ought to obey. I might not have an issue with this, except so few gods in the show feel like gods. If I'm supposed to believe that Luke's cause is so compelling that, dozens of demigods rally behind him, then I need to understand how powerful the gods are in comparison to their children. Mr. D undermines that, and I think the show's overall lackluster portrayal of the gods is going to cause issues in the future. As of right now, though, Mr. D doesn't have a big enough role in the story for me to raise any real complaints. He's just a guy. Next, we come to fan favorite mom Sally Jackson. I like that we see her more this season than in the book because it's nice to feel her presence and her positive influence in Percy's life. My only note is that Sally felt more intertwined with camp in the book. She gets a message from Chiron telling her it'd be dangerous for Percy to return to camp, and it was a small moment, but it added to the interconnectedness of the world, which, I discussed in the writing section. Sally and Chiron being in touch makes sense. She's the most present demigod parent around, and she's always been a big part of Percy's journey into this world. In the show, we don't get a sense of Sally staying in touch with Chiron, and instead of getting a warning from Chiron, when Percy shares that he had a premonition like dream, she says she did too. A dream of a spinning drachma with a trident on one side and a scythe on the other. It's implied that this is her reason for being cautious about getting Percy to camp. It's not the biggest deal in the world, especially since I doubt her and Chiron's relationship will be significant to the show. It's just a small detail that makes the interpersonal relationships feel less fleshed out. I want to see the people in Percy's life interact with each other too, and not just with him or when he's around. But anyway, on to Chiron himself. If I may return to my Harry Potter comparison, we can also draw a line between Chiron and Hagrid. What with them both being scapegoated for the main crisis of the story. Unlike Hagrid, though, show Chiron isn't present when he gets banished, so the main characters don't see him off. That was a strange choice to me because in the book, Chiron hasn't been banished yet when Percy, Annabeth, and Tyson arrive, and much like Harry and Ron going down to Hagrid's hut as he's packing up, Percy and Annabeth interact with Chiron before he has to leave. It's an important moment because Chiron directly says he's being scapegoated. The gods don't necessarily think he poisoned the tree, but they're punishing him for failing to stop it. Just like the conversation with Hagrid, Harry, and Ron, the accused character has the chance to firmly assert that they didn't do anything wrong. I know Percy and Annabeth would believe in Chiron's innocence no matter what, but an on-screen conversation would have been more impactful. We could have seen what Chiron means to each of them and how his leaving affects them, especially Annabeth since he's meant to be a father figure to her. But that goes back to my point about CGI. Maybe they just didn't want to bother. I don't have a lot to say otherwise because Chiron appears even less than in the book, but he does convey one of the biggest book to show changes in episode 8. We'll get to that later. Okay, just a couple more characters. Next up is Tantalus. Timothy Simons is a skilled actor, and I've seen his work before when he played the Eagle in the Looking for Alaska show. So the problem isn't him, though, I don't think hair, makeup, and wardrobe did him justice. He's like on the verge of looking creepy, but also just cosmically sleep deprived. My issue, once again, involves the writing and the way Simons was directed to play Tantalus. I'd forgotten till I reread the book, but Tantalus is a terrifying guy. For instance, after Percy low-key roasts him, Tantalus sentences him and Annabeth to kitchen patrol, which entails scrubbing dishes with the Harpies, who use lava instead of water. So Tantalus sent 2 children to do hours of life-threatening labor because he felt like they disrespected him. Then, when everyone's gathered to decide about the quest and the campers get rowdy, he silences everyone by absolutely losing it. He yells for them to be quiet, then tells a ghost story, which is actually a retelling of how he chopped up his own offspring and put them in a stew, and then tricked the gods into eating it. The point being, he knows how to deal with, quote, ungrateful, rebellious children, and they'd better watch themselves. In the show, I never got that strong of an impression from Tantalus. He seemed indignant about Percy's disobedience, but I never got the sense that he'd take drastic measures to act on it. So at the end of episode 2, when he shows up with a crossbow as Percy, Annabeth, and Tyson are trying to leave camp, and fires at them with the intent to kill. It came out of nowhere. I wish the writers had shown even a bit of his darker personality. I needed more unhinged behavior from him, from all of the immortal beings in the show. It'd go a long way towards making me believe that the system is faulty and does undermine demigods' best interests. I mean, the fact that Zeus was like, yeah, put this guy in charge of a bunch of kids because it'll make him miserable. It would make me root against the authority figures a lot more. The last minor character I want to address is Chris Rodriguez. He's an interesting case of character with a small book role gets a bigger role in the show. In the Sea of Monsters book, he's just kind of in one scene where Percy, Annabeth, and Tyson are sneaking around the cruise ship. They hear one of Luke's demigods nearby and identify his voice as Chris, who they know from camp. It's interesting to note that canonically, he's an undetermined camper who was stuck in the Hermes cabin, so keep that in mind. In the show, Chris is still at camp, though he's a good bit older than Percy and Annabeth. He interacts with Percy, rejects Clarisse's advances, and is chosen to go on the quest with her. Of course, she sets out on her own, so Chris stays at camp the whole season. It's not directly stated, but he's obviously meant to be an actual son of Hermes. He leads the Hermes chariot in the race and initiates the crowd cheer for his team, showing a lot of cabin pride. After the first couple episodes, we don't see him again until the season finale. We first see him stand up to Tantalus's orders, and then he encounters Clarisse in the woods around camp and starts escorting her and the fleece towards Thalia's tree. And then he stabs a fellow camper and reveals himself to be a traitor, a spy for Luke in camp. I appreciate that the show had violence on screen. It was a solid shift in tone since I didn't see it coming in the moment, and things escalated a lot from there. But I don't think it works. Chris has no motivation for his choices in the show. Even though he didn't have a huge role in the book, the fact that he was an undetermined camper made it easy to understand why he'd joined Luke's side. It also showed how persuasive Luke's cause must be. It would have gone a long way in the show if we had that one fact about Chris, but instead he seems like a respected camper with a strong sense of belonging. He shows no bitterness or reproach towards the gods, so it comes out of nowhere that he'd kill other campers for Luke's cause. Even though I appreciate the writers displaying the cost of battle and Luke's hold on his army, they've overall failed to show how demigods have been failed by the gods and the system. Those are my thoughts on Season 2's minor characters. I'd love to hear your thoughts on any or all of them, and I'm curious to see how they might be better utilized in future seasons. I'm always open to character development, and I'd gain respect for the writers if they manage to turn static characters into dynamic players. We'll see how that goes when Season 3 comes out. I might have had a handful more characters to talk about, but the show chose not to introduce various people this season. Charles Beckendorf, son of Hephaestus, the only camper who makes Tyson feel welcome and teaches him metalworking at the armory. Travis and Connor Stoll, mischievous twin sons of Hermes. Selena Beauregard, daughter of Aphrodite, who gives Percy Pegasus riding lessons and whom he calls one of the nicer Aphrodite children. Their absence is unfortunate for a couple reasons. For one, it shrinks the world. Whereas Percy interacted with these characters in the book, they don't exist in the show. Is this really an interconnected camp if our main character only talks to his close circle of friends and the several other characters with speaking roles? Furthermore, if other minor characters knew Percy, it'd make him feel like part of the world and add to the realism that the show's missing. Equally of significance, these characters go on to play important roles in the story. So here we have a dilemma. The writers were probably pressed for screen time this season, but it won't be any easier to squeeze their introductions into future seasons, especially now that they were supposed to exist already. There'll be additional material in whatever season they're introduced, on top of all the plot points and character beats that have to be covered. The longer the writers wait, the less time they'll have to make viewers care about these characters, and because they'll be important in the story later on, that's not good. I'd rather have an imperfect introduction than for the writers to exclude the characters altogether, but If they don't come in during season 3, I do fear that several parts of the story will be seriously derailed. Okay, I know that might have been a lot, but I hope this section gave you some food for thought. I'd love to hear your thoughts on your favorite characters and how you feel they were portrayed this season. I'd love to hear if there were any points you want to add to my criticism, if there are any points you disagree with me on. I'm open to hearing different perspectives, and just know that I still love these characters with my whole heart. Like I said of the minor characters, I'd love to see the writers strengthen the writing for the main cast, and I think there's room to do so, just like I think there's room to let the actors express more emotion. I want an entertaining viewing experience that doesn't compromise the core of these beloved characters, and that's doable. So, yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and in the meantime, let's move on to the final section, the book to show changes in Season 2. First, I actually want to mention some things that largely stayed the same and were well executed. It might come off like I hated the season and thought there was nothing good. That's not true, but I know some people probably clicked off because they were kind of put off by how critical I'm being. So, for everyone who stayed to hear me out, I've got to at least try and balance the scales. So, here's a rundown of things the show preserved well from book to show. I like that they opened episode 1 with the same dream sequence as in the book, with Percy seeing Grover under threat. Calling back to the book is reliable, and I thought they brought the environment to life pretty well. I also think it was important to introduce Grover immediately so we feel his importance to the story, since, for Percy, saving Grover is just as important, if not more important, than saving the fleece. The Grey Sisters cab scene was very entertaining overall. I'm glad they kept it fast paced and chaotic, and the sisters looked sufficiently decrepit. I wasn't sure how they'd approach the visuals, but I think they did a good job, and the effects of the cab coming in and out of the smoke were very, very clean. I know I've critiqued the CGI a lot, but this scene impressed me. I forgot that Percy, Annabeth, and Tyson don't realize they're on Luke's ship at first. All they know is Hermes sent them to this cruise ship and told them it would get them where they need to go, so I forgot about the reveal that it's the Princess Andromeda, and I think the show executed it well. It was a tense scene with small reveals that led to the final revelation, and the camera cutting to the outside of the ship in all its massive glory was very effective. I like that Tyson's ability to smell monsters came into play, especially once they reached Princess Andromeda. It's a bit of lore that helps him feel like a thought out character. I wasn't a fan of Luke's wardrobe at first because I thought it was unrealistic for the leader of, a ruthless counter movement against the gods. But then I reread the Princess Andromeda portion of the book, and turns out it's completely accurate. To quote Percy, Luke looks like an evil model here, and wardrobe accomplished that with the preppy academia look. I would have loved if they emphasized the evil part a little more, but hey, they got the model vibe down. When it came to the scenes on Clarisse's ship in the Sea of Monsters, I liked that the final straw was still the Thermos of the Four Winds, getting unscrewed a little too far. The whole scene was executed well, the frantic running around, fighting against the winds and the water, the devastation of the whole ship ripping apart and turning to nothingness. Even after finishing the rest of the season, that's still a standout scene. On Cersei's island, I like that the pirates got transformed back into humans at the same time as Percy, then chased Cersei around and wreaked havoc on the place. It was a wonderful dose of chaos, especially with the otherwise serious tone of the episode. Finally, I already mentioned this in Annabeth's section, but the nobody sequence on Polyphemus' island was very well done, and Leah Savage Jeffries got to show some refreshing edge with her acting. It made it obvious to me she's got potential in her, and I hope she's allowed to show it more in the future. Okay, that's everything I wrote down for things that stayed the same and were also fun or satisfying. I hope it was enough to show that I do appreciate a lot of the things about this season, before we get into the rest of this section. We're now going to discuss changes from the book to the show. Obviously, I can't discuss every single difference because then this video would be even longer than it already is. Instead, my goal is to discuss the changes that stood out to me and the ones that significantly impacted the story. With each change, I'll break down the details, speculate on the potential logic behind it, and give my thoughts on whether or not it worked in service of the story. I want discussion to flow naturally, so I'll do my best to integrate each of those points as I go. As with everything else in the video, these are strictly my opinions. This is the only section that'll go fully in chronological order, and I think it'll be fun. Let's get into it. Starting off with episode 1, I play dodgeball with cannibals, and please forgive the change in background. I rearranged my bookshelf in between filming sessions. The first change I want to talk about is the opening sequence. Percy does dream about Grover in both versions, but the threat that Grover's running from is different. In the book, it's unseen but definitely monstrous. To quote page 2, he was trying to get away from something. A bone rattling growl cut through the storm. Behind Grover, at the far end of the block, a shadowy figure loomed. It swatted aside a street lamp, which burst in a shower of sparks. We've got good tension here and also a bit of mystery. What's chasing him, and will he escape unscathed? It provides fantastic stakes for the story because Percy's not only trying to recover the fleece to save Thalia's tree, he's also trying to find Grover and save his life. In the show, the initial threat is mortal. A group of Luke's demigods confront Grover in the woods, led by Allison. They're about to kill Grover because he knows too much, which is only because Allison says out loud, quote, Luke is not going to be happy, and Grover uses nature magic to flee. Once he gets to the beach, only then is he grabbed by a tentacle and dragged out of sight. In my mind, the logic for this is straightforward. The show wanted to introduce Luke's demigod army as a threat right away, and they also wanted to save the CGI budget. But I think those threads of logic are both flawed, and here's why. One, if the only way to make us believe in the main antagonist group is to introduce them as soon as humanly possible, then the antagonists aren't written very well. In fact, Allison aims her bow at Grover and explains why he can't be left alive instead of just shooting him. So at that point, I don't believe anything's going to happen to Grover, and the antagonists look incompetent. As for the CGI budget, I'd argue that's also a bad reason. Like, a monster who's out to kill you is a lot more terrifying than demigods who can't commit to killing you even when you know vital information about their group. And the CGI budget was expended this episode anyway, both for the nature magic vines and the tentacle that drags Grover away. I doubt it would have taken any more budget to animate a vaguely silhouetted monster. The next change is how Tyson entered Percy's life. In the book, he's homeless and attending Merriweather College prep with Percy. He's big, awkward, and emotionally stunted, which makes him an easy target for bullies. Percy is his only friend, and he doesn't know Tyson is a Cyclops at first because the Mist can work on demigods too. In the show, Tyson's actually living with Percy and Sally. He was initially homeless, but Sally met him while volunteering and took him in. Tyson goes to school with Percy, where he is indeed awkward, and Percy is his only friend. Additionally, Percy and Sally know he's a Cyclops. I was initially against the change, but now my feelings are neutral. The writers probably wanted to save time on the Cyclops reveal, and Tyson and Sally needed a personal connection for later events to make sense. It's also possible they were worried about visual consistency. If we saw Daniel Deemer's normal human face at the start of the season, it might have been difficult to buy into the Cyclops CGI the rest of the time. That said, I think we lose something by not having the Cyclops reveal. I want more world building and whimsical elements. It's interesting that the Mist can work on demigods, and I could be wrong, but I think that'll be important in later parts of the story. That said, I'm happy with everything else involving Tyson this season, so I won't pretend this is a big deal to me, it's just something that stood out. Something that is a big deal, in my opinion, is the lack of screen time at Percy's school. The first chunk of the book takes place at Percy's school. We see his everyday life outside camp, which supports the point that he's one of the rare demigods with a childhood, and the school serves as a higher stakes setting for monster conflict. Percy has to fight off Laestrygonian giants and keep his peers safe, and the aftermath causes a ruckus in the news and the community. I understand the need to condense and combine scenes, but completely leaving out Percy's school makes his life feel less thought out. Since the scene with Nancy Bobofit in Season 1, Episode 1, we haven't seen him interact with kids his age outside of camp. The change also lessens his interactions with bullies, even though it feels important to show how he reacts to those things. The whole point is that he isn't like Luke. Now, because Percy grew up with a loving mother and some sense of stability, he resists oppressive forces and wants to reform the institutions that enable them. Luke, who has never known stability, wants to burn everything to the ground and remake the world as he sees fit. That's the nuance the show wishes it was setting up. At school, we also see Percy's resentment over how Tyson's friendship makes him a bigger target for bullying as well. That's a great way to introduce Percy's complex feelings, considering the show doesn't really set up a reason why Percy doesn't fully vibe with Tyson at first. I'm not saying the show should have included every single moment at school, obviously that would have been overkill, but no scenes at school is an even more detrimental approach. Anyway, on to the next change, the opening battle slash battles. In the book, Percy is targeted by Laestrygonian giants who call him by name. Then, when the group arrives at camp, they help fight off two bronze bulls. It's a great scene because coming off the Grey Sisters cab ride, there's a fantastic sense of momentum. Camp is actively under attack when they arrive, making it a genuine emergency and keeping up the frenetic pace. The show combined those scenes. The trio are targeted by giants just outside of camp, and they aren't out to get Percy specifically. Instead, they're acting as a distraction while Luke sneaks around to poison Thalia's tree. And there are no bronze bulls at all. So, what do we lose by not having the bronze bulls in the show? For one, it removes a scene where Percy interacts with other characters, which is detrimental to the world building. For two, it removes the power imbalance between the characters and the threats. Book Clarisse and a group of campers try to hold off the bulls, but a lot of them are wounded in this scene, which the first part of the season lacked. If the show wanted to cut out the bulls and just have the giants, it should have been a widespread team effort to demonstrate the scope of what they're dealing with. Another problem is that in the book, Tyson's strength is demonstrated early on. To quote page 43, his fists made a crater where the bronze bull's snout used to be. Two small columns of flame shot out of its ears. Tyson hit it again, and the bronze crumpled under his hands like aluminum foil. So if the bulls are out, Tyson should have shown his strength against the giants. Instead, he flees with Percy and Annabeth, and later on, his strength comes out of nowhere. And if Tyson hasn't proven that he can defend himself, it makes zero sense for Annabeth to hesitate over letting him into camp. In the book, once Percy's life was in danger, she immediately gave Tyson permission to enter. In the show, her hesitation makes her seem callous. I think the writers wanted to plant the seed of her dislike for Cyclops, but, Tyson will die if he can't enter camp, and Percy puts himself in danger to protect him. All of that could have been avoided if she just acknowledged the constraints of the situation like she did in the book. Oh, here's a huge change. In the book, no one sees Thalia's tree get poisoned. I already discussed this in relation to the presumption of Chiron's guilt and a sense of ambiguity, as well as Luke's presence feeling overdone. Here, I want to make a point about the timing of the poisoning. Since the show wanted Percy and Annabeth to see Luke poisoning the tree, it happens right as they run up to the field. In the book, it happened before they arrived at camp at all. There's already a darker tone at camp when they get there because everyone else has been dealing with the weakened barrier and lowered morale. It also makes the stakes more urgent because if they want to find a way to heal the tree, they're working on a partially run down clock. It bothers me when things happen so conveniently. Of course, Luke poisoned the tree right as the main characters ran up. I get that the writers wanted to have more of him in this season, but in the book, it mattered that the main characters had been absent from camp. In the show, apparently it wouldn't have made a difference because Luke decided to enact his plan once they got there one way or another. Moving on to episode 2, Demon Pigeons Attack. My first note is more of an umbrella topic, but this show lacks camp-wide group scenes. In the book, Tyson's claiming happens while everyone's eating dinner, which is a huge source of embarrassment for Percy. In the show, Tyson gets claimed in front of Percy, Annabeth, Tantalus, Clarisse, and a few other campers right after Tantalus ordered them to kill Tyson. So his claiming is a solution to that conflict, and it's shocking to the characters who are present, but not as impactful as the book's version. The world building around the dining pavilion is also lacking, like little things like sacrificing food to the gods and the magical fire, and the visual of Percy and Tyson sitting alone at the Poseidon table. Details like that would have gone a long way towards establishing camp as a full place with its own community and hierarchy. My best guess is that the show didn't want to film a lot of scenes with extras, and they didn't want to cast background characters who'd return in future seasons. If that's the case, I think it's pretty silly, especially considering all the extras visible during the chariot race, and it undermines the impact of Percy standing up to challenge Tantalus in front of everyone. We see people in the room and they're wearing Camp Half Blood t shirts, but we don't know any of them. Who cares what they think of Percy or Clarisse or Annabeth? Next up, I want to look at an interaction between Percy and Tantalus. In the book, Percy plans to convince Tantalus to let them quest for the fleece by bringing it up during a campfire. He announces to all of camp that there's a way to save Thalia's tree, and the public display forces Tantalus's hand. In the show, Percy kind of raises his voice in a common area with other campers walking around, but Tantalus pulls him aside pretty quickly, and Percy tells him the coordinates one on one. I don't like this change. The idea was probably like Percy's trying to prove that he has useful information, but he hasn't seen anything to suggest Tantalus could be trusted with this or that he would take it seriously. By confronting Tantalus one on one instead of with an audience, he completely frees him from accountability. The change also enables goofy miscommunication. Because Percy gave Tantalus the coordinates one on one, when Tantalus incorrectly recites them to all of camp, the only people who could call him on it are Percy and Annabeth. Since Annabeth's trying to keep Percy off the quest, she stops him before he can make any real complaints. All this leads to Clarisse working off false information until she realizes the origin of the mistake. More on that later. And side note, I noticed what I believe is a huge plot hole with these coordinates. In the book, it was my understanding that Luke's spies within camp fed him the coordinates Percy said at the campfire, which is how Luke knew where to intercept them on Miami Beach after they left Polyphemus's island. But in the show, if we assume Chris Rodriguez fed Luke info, then the coordinates he heard from Tantalus were incorrect. And that doesn't make sense because, unlike in the book, Luke shows up on Polyphemus's island. But again, more on that later. In the meantime, on to the next umbrella category, the chariot race. First, let's talk about the whole thing where Percy doesn't know about the great prophecy and Chiron asks Annabeth to keep him from going on the quest. Her agreeing to go behind his back is a weird juxtaposition from her and Percy's united front just beforehand, when they schemed to distract Tantalus so she could sneak into his office. All the deception that followed felt contrived and not at all true to the deep trust they're supposed to have. I think the writers wanted to create drama, but the book conflict, Annabeth and Percy snapping at each other over Tyson and her feelings about Cyclops, was so effective. Her storming off after they both let their emotions get the better of them is way different from betraying his trust completely. Connected to that, Percy knows about the great prophecy in the books. To quote page 53 during a conversation between Annabeth and Chiron, I said, would this be the super dangerous prophecy that has me in it, but the gods have forbidden you to tell me about it? This is a great example of Percy figuring something out with context clues, and it also adds more realistic stakes. He knows of the prophecy, so the main concern at this point is steering him on a good path, instead of straight up hiding it from him. It's such a brief line that I wouldn't be surprised if Rick Riordan himself forgot that Percy's supposed to know about the great prophecy at this point. Plus, of course, the writers wanted the angst of Annabeth having to hide something from Percy even though she really cares about him. I'm not gonna knock them too hard for this change, I just think it's a bit much. Oh, and even though Percy and Annabeth are annoyed with each other in the books, he still approaches her before the race and tells her about his dream with Grover. She's skeptical, which makes sense. To quote page 77, she says, oh, right, like Grover would just happen to stumble across the one thing that could save the camp. When he protests, she offers that empathy links are really difficult to form, so it was probably just a regular dream. Finally, Percy says that they should consult the Oracle, which sobers her because it's a testament to how serious he is. This interaction speaks to how well they understand each other, and I like that he had to convince her with solid arguments. To be honest, the show doesn't treat the empathy link with the gravity it deserves. I get that the writers wanted to hop right into the chariot race after setting up Annabeth's secret, but considering Percy and Grover's friendship is already underdeveloped, it's a shame they didn't make the empathy link feel significant. My final note about the race is that the stakes felt different because we have no idea who any of these people are. Chris is some guy with a few lines at first, and Annabeth races with an Athena camper named Bronte, but it's the first time we've heard of her. We don't know these characters, we're not invested in them. In the book, I like that Percy makes a point to say even the nicest campers aren't afraid to seriously hurt people to win the race, and then the people involved are named speaking characters that we know, like the Stoll brothers, like Charles Beckendorf. This goes back to my point about not introducing some minor characters. It saves time, but we end up with a chariot race where I couldn't care less what happens to anyone except Percy and Annabeth. It's not a good thing that they're the only ones who feel real enough to care about. Pivoting a little, I want to talk about those empathy link dreams. In the book, we feel Polyphemus's presence because Percy hears his voice echoing through the cave. He's a constant threat that limits Grover's ability to speak properly. He can't just tell Percy, I'm in Polyphemus's cave in the Sea of Monsters and he has the golden fleece, because Polyphemus would hear him, and Grover's too panicked to articulate himself anyway. The show, meanwhile, doesn't let us see Polyphemus at all until episode 5. While I understand the desire to hide an antagonist for a big reveal, especially since they didn't go that route with Luke, it undermines the danger that Grover's in. He tells Percy he's in trouble, but it'd be more menacing if we could see a huge shadow on the wall, hear a rumbling voice, watch Grover cower as he tries to keep up his bridal act. It would have made Polyphemus a credible threat from the get-go. There's a small moment in the book that stems from Percy hearing Polyphemus's voice, and it's an interesting layer that the show missed out on. He hears Polyphemus speak, and when he wakes up, he hears Tyson's voice and thinks it sounds just like Polyphemus. It unsettles him, and it's a great way to show his ongoing struggle to come to terms with who Tyson is and accept him as a brother. Speaking of, the last change I want to discuss is Percy's conversation with Hermes at the end of episode 2 on the Camp Half-Blood Lakeshore. Right off the bat, Percy's intentions going down to the water differ. In the book, he went to go clear his head since it's kind of a chill spot for him. In the show, he packed a bag with the intention of setting off alone. He went to the water to ask Poseidon for his blessing to break the rules. You could argue it's a small change, but I'd argue it suggests the wrong kind of arrogance. Percy thinking he could take on a whole quest by himself is silly, especially when the show hasn't given much evidence to make me believe he could handle himself. I get he's mad at Annabeth for going behind his back and doesn't want to talk to her, but up and leaving in the middle of the night with one backpack and no plan is absurd. Frankly, I think it's a mischaracterization. Anyway, Percy appealing to Poseidon happens in the book, but only once the patrol harpies are on their way to attack him and his friends. Poseidon sends Hippocampi to carry them out to the cruise ship, saving them from the harpies and kickstarting their quest. He is in fact paying attention to Percy, his only demigod son, even if he can't interfere any further. It also makes sense because Tyson, whom he just claimed, is in danger too. In the show, things are a bit ambiguous. Percy addresses Poseidon, but Hermes emerges from the fog and says Poseidon sent him. Based on the way the actors play the scene, I'm not sure if the implication is A. Poseidon did send Hermes with a message and gifts, he just couldn't be bothered to directly respond, or B. Hermes only said that because he needed a reason to approach Percy, and Poseidon didn't actually respond at all. Hermes' motivations are less clear in the show, and while I don't mind that on its own, it removes one of the only threads between Percy and Poseidon. Considering my main hypothesis for this change is that the show didn't want to CGI Hippocampi at close range, I'm disappointed at what was sacrificed to simplify the moment. Instead of the Hippocampi, when Hermes departs, he summons a small boat, which the protagonists use to flee Tantalus. On to episode 3, we board the Princess Andromeda. We see another timeline shift with the trio's arrival aboard the ship. In the book, they climb up the side ladders in the middle of the night, whereas in the show, it's fully light out by the time they get to the ship, which really calls into question how they weren't spotted. To be charitable, we could say Luke knew they were there and was biding his time, because otherwise I have no idea what would justify this. Maybe the writers just didn't want to show them sleeping. The supplies they bring differs too. In the book, Hermes leaves Percy with a bag for each of them, complete with, quote, extra clothes, toiletries, camp rations, a Ziploc bag full of cash, a leather pouch full of stolen drachmas. Page 115. It's a quick line, but I appreciate that Riordan explicitly mentioned the resources they had access to. In the show, they're just getting by somehow. Percy has a change of clothes for Tyson, but that's kind of mysterious, and even though we see a shot of the bag Hermes left for him, it doesn't look big enough to contain rations and supplies for 3 people. Oh, and Percy says aloud that Hermes didn't include any drachma. Remember that for later. It makes it impossible to buy into the realism. I think the only scene of anyone eating this whole season is Percy making himself a snack before the Sea of Monsters confrontation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's bonkers. I'm not saying I need to see every bite of food and every sip of water, but from what we're shown, the characters should have dropped dead around episode 4 or 5. I've discussed it a bit already, but their confrontation with Luke also plays out quite differently. In the book, Luke gets under Annabeth's skin by suggesting she's dishonoring Thalia's memory by traveling with Tyson, a Cyclops. He plays into the closeness Annabeth felt with Thalia, and even though she doesn't believe him, it still throws her off balance. In the show, Luke instead suggests Annabeth didn't know Thalia very well, since she only traveled with him for 2 months. In essence, the writers seem to be hinting that both Luke and Annabeth feel possession over Thalia. There's a world where that could work, but I'd argue the book's version better demonstrates that Luke knows how to push Annabeth's buttons. In the show, his argument is pretty weak. Basically, well, you're wrong because I've known her longer, so there. Yet I'm supposed to believe that rattles Annabeth enough to make her doubt her whole relationship with Thalia? Similarly, in the book, Luke offers Percy and Annabeth a pretty sweet deal in exchange for joining him: wealth and security for Sally, and an architectural career for Annabeth. Obviously, there was no chance they'd take it, but it shows how well he knows their desires. In the show, Luke's offer is, Percy, if you join me, it'll motivate other half bloods to join me. That way, when I invade camp, fewer campers will resist, and I won't have to kill them. Like, literally, why would Percy agree to that? He has no reason to believe Luke wouldn't just kill everyone anyway. Then, in the book, when Percy and Annabeth reject Luke's offer, he orders his guards to feed them to the Dragon. After all, if Percy won't stand with him, then he's a liability and he can't be left alive. In the show, when the group shows skepticism, he brings them down to the hold to show them what a blended world of demigods and monsters could look like, ostensibly to change their minds. There's no immediate threat here, not even from the Laestrygonians, who are busy making friends with Tyson. I can only think that the writers wanted to support Luke's sympathetic arc, but again, if they won't show him being a ruthless, decisive leader, his future actions are going to seem completely bonkers. Given the different setups, the group's escape also looks different. In the book, as they're escorted towards the dungeon, Percy signals to Tyson, who incapacitates one of their monster escorts, while Annabeth disables one of the human guards. However, the other guard hits the alarm, triggering the ship's defenses. They sprint for a lifeboat, narrowly avoiding arrows and other weapons as they use the thermos of the four winds to speed away. It's a fantastic sequence. In the show, Tyson builds an exploding fire orb that conveniently incapacitates everyone except the protagonists long enough that they can run out of the room as Luke and the others stumble to their feet. They hop into a lifeboat, being chased but not directly attacked, and encounter no resistance as they speed away. Luke just watches angrily from the deck. It's less involved in the sense that it requires fewer characters and visuals, which is probably the point. I know a chaotic escape scene would have been a feat of effects and animation, but come on, we've got to have some fun. It's goofy that they escape without a single enemy leaping or shooting at them, and it squashes what little belief I had in the competence of Luke's army. Finally, in the book, as they ride away from the ship, Percy and Annabeth iris message Chiron to catch him up to speed. Remember what I told you to keep in mind? In the show, Hermes specifically didn't give them any drachma, hence why this scene couldn't happen. But yeah, in the book, Percy overhears Chiron tell Annabeth that she shouldn't have let him leave camp. I prefer this subtlety versus the straightforward conversation in the show where Annabeth just explains the whole prophecy to him. The book's version also comes off the back of Luke telling Percy that the prophecy has something to do with Percy turning 16, specifically if he turns 16. It's an effective way for him to sow doubt in Percy's mind, especially when Percy thought he'd made peace with not knowing the details. It's way better than Annabeth telling him about it, because why would she be the voice of authority here? And it's only possible because Percy knew of the prophecy to begin with. I imagine the writers thought, well, if we want Kronos to hold the prophecy over Percy's head later, he's gotta know about it, but the same effect would have been accomplished with his amount of knowledge in the book. It just feels like the writers jumped the gun on a mystery that should have been unraveled over time. On to episode 4, Clarisse blows up everything. This season, we see a few flashback scenes with Thalia, and I actually think it's a good change overall. It kickstarts the viewer's attachment to her and lets her personality come through on its own, rather than through others talking about her. That said, it's an interesting choice to keep the same Luke and Thalia actors as in present day, especially next to a recast younger Annabeth. I had no concept of how old Luke and Thalia were meant to be at first, and then I found out he's 14 and she's 12. Visually, this just doesn't work. Charlie Bushnell is clearly an adult, maybe 16 or 17 at best, and Tamara Smart looks the same age because she basically is. In real life, he's 21 and she's 20. So they're standing next to young Annabeth, a child around 7 years old, and it's like, what is this? Of course they're supposed to be older than her, but this is way too far. I get the show didn't want to hire additional people, but it's impossible to believe these flashbacks happened 7 years ago. The next umbrella of changes is basically everything to do with Clarisse's ship. In the book, the trio has to fight a Hydra, at which point Clarisse pulls up with celestial bronze weapons. She obliterates the Hydra and reluctantly brings them aboard. She hates being around them, but recognizes the mutual benefits they stand to gain, and now they kinda owe her one. In the show, Clarisse destroys their ship because she needs the correct fleece coordinates. Percy challenges her to a one-on-one duel, which she forfeits once Annabeth starts taking out members of her undead crew. This is one of the biggest plot changes and makes their collaboration afterwards seem completely unbelievable. In the book, Clarisse's crew were just a means to an end, but show Clarisse cares about them a lot, so Annabeth shanking them back to the underworld should have permanently soured her against them. And yet, also, her blowing up their ship doesn't really align with her sympathetic arc. My theory is the show didn't want to CGI a Hydra, but they had to CGI the ship exploding, so it's not like they got off completely scot-free. My secondary theory is they wanted an extra fight scene, but no one's winning the duel when Annabeth starts taking out the crew, so the fight didn't change the status quo or affect the character dynamics. It's all pointless, even though Dior Goodjohn looked really suave wielding her spear. Aboard the ship, Percy learns about Clarisse and Ares' dynamic differently. In the book, he accidentally overhears their conversation in the boiler deck. Clarisse is desperate to please her father as he threatens her not to fail her mission. She doesn't know Percy's listening and would probably kill him if she knew. In the show, she gets vulnerable with Percy one-on-one before they face the Sea of Monsters, expressing uncertainty about her worthiness to complete the quest. Even with her sympathetic arc, this felt uncharacteristic, and it doesn't carry the same nuance of Percy having to reconcile the Clarisse he saw in the boiler deck with the cruel girl he knows. It's a bit hasty in her character development, considering she just blew up his ship and tried to beat him up. I would have preferred if Clarisse showed cracks in her armor without articulating herself to Percy. He could piece things together instead of being told. You also can't convince me she would share the lines of the prophecy with him, but whatever, that's all I have to say about episode 4. This was a bit of a shorter section. This will be longer. Episode 5, we check into Cece's spa and resort. This is the only time I'll break chronology to say it's disappointing that we're shown Clarisse is still alive so quickly. Dior Goodjohn is a great actress, and I'm sure the writers wanted more scenes with her, but it's similar to the Luke problem. Because we see so much of her and Grover in the cave, those scenes don't end up feeling as meaningful or necessary. In the book, when Percy and Annabeth get to Polyphemus's island, they see a lifeboat and realize there are one or more survivors. The show could have taken a similar approach, or if the writers just had to show Clarisse alive, then show her waking up and Percy and Annabeth coming across a lifeboat. There's dramatic irony in that. The viewers know it's her, but Percy and Annabeth aren't sure yet. I also didn't vibe with the Polyphemus is actually smart storyline. It might be the writer's way of going, look, there are smart monsters, but isn't that the point of Tyson? He changes the characters' perspectives of what a monster can look like and how maybe that's an unfair label. Plus, if the show wanted Polyphemus to be more intelligent than he let on, here's what I don't get. Why would he reveal that to Grover and Clarisse and thus to the viewer? I like seeing other perspectives, but most of the cave scenes didn't contribute enough to justify their existence. It would have been better to save the reveal that Clarisse was still alive and have episode 5 focus solely on Cersei's island and the sirens. That would leave more time for the mystery to unfold and for Percy and Annabeth to work through the sirens' trial and the aftermath. But anyway, we'll come back to Polyphemus's island in the episode 6 discussion. Getting back to chronology, the character's arrival on Cersei's island goes differently. In the book, Percy wakes up in a rowboat after Annabeth pulled him and some of their supplies out of the water, and she breaks the news that Tyson didn't make it. They sail for hours, during which they discuss what they know about the Great Prophecy, and eventually a current catches them and brings them to Cersei's island. In the show, they wake up in a foggy room where a woman greets them. She says they were pulled from the ship's wreckage and there were no other survivors. Percy and Annabeth already talked about the prophecy at the end of episode 3, so this change is a logical result of that. However, it removes the aspect of them privately grieving before they get to the island. It's not just Annabeth telling him about the prophecy and getting angsty, they discuss possibilities, they process emotions. I understand the writers wanted to jump into the action on the island, but that came at the cost of a real bonding moment. The show also changes why Percy and Annabeth are so cooperative with Cersei. In the book, there are magical elements relaxing them and easing their concerns. As they enter the resort, Percy hears Cersei singing, which makes him more trusting. Also, as I mentioned in the writing section, he's so exhausted and hungry that he'll go along with pretty much anything. In the show, Percy and Annabeth want to get back on the quest, and they seem to genuinely believe that Cersei can help prepare them. We don't know why they find her trustworthy, especially because they learn her identity early on. And because their exhausted desperation isn't conveyed, I don't see how they wouldn't be suspicious or at least skeptical. A couple notes on the introduction of the sirens. I like the addition of the scene where Stavros, a soldier at the resort, falls prey to the sirens. It's a bit of darkness and violence that's been rare in the series, and it effectively establishes the stakes of the trial. The sirens look pretty different too. On page 195, Percy describes them as, quote, a flock of vultures the size of people, with dirty black plumage, gray talons, and wrinkled pink necks. Now imagine human heads on top of those necks, but the human heads keep changing. While their faces change into various people that Percy knows, quote, no matter what shape they took, their mouths were greasy and caked with the remnants of old meals. That's genuinely disgusting. In the show, the sirens are vaguely humanoid creatures of stone, rooted to the earth in a semicircle. That's still threatening, but not as disturbing as the book's description. And practically, I understand the CGI might have been difficult to execute, but emotionally, the book's visuals better represent the sirens' ability to get in your head. I'm not sure why they look like rock people in the show. That's not really explained. Speaking of appearances, we're going to talk about Annabeth and makeup again. In the book, Percy's already a guinea pig when he sees Annabeth's makeover, and he's surprised that she looks really nice, but also he thinks it feels wrong because it's blatantly not her. In the show, both of them get a makeover at the same time and agree that they both look ridiculous. It doesn't read like Percy feels any sort of way about her appearance, and her transformation doesn't hit the same because she's had a lot of makeup on the whole season. Instead of a natural hint at Percabeth, we got a haha, they both look funny moment instead. It's another choice I don't quite understand. Alright, now we've got to talk about how Percy and Annabeth learn Cersei's identity. In the book, a few things lead Annabeth to realize Cece is actually Cersei. First, Cersei reveals her magic by moving fire over her hand. Then she says her mother is Hecate, a Greek goddess associated with magic and witchcraft. Then she calls herself the greatest sorceress ever, at which point Annabeth is like, wait a second. In the show, Annabeth has this realization after A, Cersei uses magic to lift a book in the air, and B, she observes the caged animals in Cersei's office. And then the exchange goes like this. I think I just figured out who you really are. You mean Cersei? Because I'm not trying to hide. Cersei the witch. Come on. I saw a Reddit comment prior to season 2 that was like, oh, I can't wait for Percy to say you're Cersei, but that's basically what happened. You cannot tell me this is more satisfying than Annabeth slowly realizing who Cersei is after she's been posing as this other persona. I can't fathom why the writers went about it like this. And despite that, Show Percy is extremely bold with confronting Cersei. He goes into her office all, my guess is this is exactly what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, your guess? Why does he know everything? And why would he tell her he's suspicious? He knows she's Cersei. The show wants us to view Percy as this audacious, capable character, but he took an unreasonable risk and got turned into a guinea pig. In the book, Cersei targets Percy immediately. She separates him and Annabeth as soon as they get to her office, and after showing him his insecurities, she offers him a potion that'll turn him into his perfect self. With his defenses lowered, he drinks it and turns into a guinea pig. It makes her seem calculated and manipulative, and it doesn't make him look like an idiot for showing his hand when he ought to know how dangerous she is. Something the show actually drops, on the other hand, is Cersei's man-hating. In the book, her philosophy is that men are pigs, which is why she transforms them into guinea pigs. In the show, instead, her thing is that she's lonely and she doesn't want the heroes on her island to leave and get back to their quests. Instead, she manipulates them into thinking they need her help in order to improve themselves and pass the siren's trial when, in reality, she chooses who to give the special wax to in order to block the siren's call. It's a weird shift that matches the show's efforts to make certain characters more sympathetic, but while I kind of understood the logic with Luke and Clarisse, for example, it makes much less sense for Cersei. I liked the absurd logic of her villainy in the book. It made her fun and memorable. I feel like the show watered down her motivations because the writers, or maybe Disney, didn't want to commit to making a man hater a main villain, and definitely not a sympathetic one. But come on, where's the fun in that? And plus, this whole thing of, I don't want people to leave my island because then I'll be lonely, makes her a bit too similar to Calypso. Not that she'll be relevant for a long time, but it's an odd choice. Then we come to the part of the episode where it's Annabeth's time to save the day. It's a nice touch in the show that Annabeth finally realizes something's wrong when she sees Riptide, Percy's sword, in the pen holder on Cersei's desk. It's a good moment of show don't tell that Leah Savage Jeffries plays well with facial expressions, so kudos for that. That said, I do think Annabeth gets to show more personality with this revelation in the book. She takes one of Hermes' vitamins before Cersei re-enters the room so she's immune to her transformative magic, then leaps at Cersei and holds a dagger to her throat to get her to turn Percy back into a human. She problem solves, then gets to be vulnerable, showing how much she cares about Percy without saying it so heavily. But anyway, after their escape, we come to the Sirens. In the book, Percy and Annabeth sail for a bit and have a conversation about why Annabeth struggles with Cyclops. After that, they see the Sirens' Island coming up ahead. In the show, they had that conversation before they faced the Sea of Monsters, so once they escape Cersei, they immediately confront the Sirens. It's also worth noting that the show linked those two things since Cersei used the Sirens to keep people on the island. I already discussed the change to Annabeth's backstory, so I won't dwell on it here, but this is the second instance of the show leaping into the action and forgoing an emotionally vulnerable conversation between characters in just this episode. Of course, the Sirens sequence itself plays out very differently. In the book, the Sirens expose your deepest desires, so Annabeth asks Percy to tie her to the mast so she can hear the song and become wiser. Once she hears the song, though, she begs for Percy to cut her loose, and he feels so bad that he has to look away. He doesn't see her cut herself loose and make a swim for the island. In the show, Annabeth tied Percy to the mast and was about to plug her ears with wax so they could sail through the gap, but Circe snatched the jar of wax with her magic. Annabeth initially thinks she can resist the siren song on her own, but of course she can't. Somehow she gets to the island. We don't see her dismount from the ship, and she doesn't really look wet as she's walking up to the sirens, but I don't know, who knows. Walker Scobell does get good acting moments here, begging Annabeth to cut him loose so he can help and growing more desperate as the siren song affects her, but I actually would have preferred if Leah Savard Jeffries got to show her acting chops here. Annabeth has so few scenes where she gets to be emotional and distressed instead of just annoyed and worried, and the show cut yet another one of them. But what made Annabeth so hooked by the song in the first place? What did she see? In the book, Annabeth envisions her dad and Athena reunited and Luke still her friend, all of them picnicking in Central Park while a Manhattan that she redesigned rises in the background. The vision covers her relationship with her parents, her desire for Athena's approval, her inability to lose hope that Luke can be saved, her endless ambition to build and be recognized. It's impactful, and it suggests Luke got in her head when he asked her to join him. In the show, her vision consists of her walking down a sewer tunnel, approaching Percy and Luke in the middle of an argument while Grover tries to get between them. Once she gets closer, they ask her for a word of advice to resolve their conflict. I actually cannot fathom what the writers were thinking. What does this vision convey that Annabeth is torn between Luke and Percy and believes she can bring them together? That hasn't been set up at all, and frankly, Annabeth's relationship with Luke hasn't been meaningfully portrayed either. I do like getting to see the vision from her perspective, since in the book, Percy just grabs her ankle and gets a brief flash. One of the show's greatest strengths is its freedom of perspective, which is why I hate that they didn't show an incredible dreamscape. You can't convince me that a dark, gray sewer is more tantalizing than a world of her creation where everyone she's lost lives in peace. In terms of how they get out of the situation, in the book, Percy stops Annabeth from reaching the island at all. He uses his powers to navigate through the water, then grapples with her and submerges her to interrupt the siren song. He forms an air bubble around them so she can breathe, and once she comes back to reality, she breaks down sobbing in his arms. In the show, she thinks she's outsmarted the sirens at first, but in reality, they use an illusion of Athena to make her drop her guard. When she takes Athena's hand, the sirens grab hold of her, at which point Percy comes in to yank her back. They make it back to the ship, and she's shaken for a bit, but she doesn't get the same emotional release as in the book. The show's version kind of takes the intensity out of the moment, and it drains Annabeth of nuance. Why can't she look unflattering for a bit while she sobs? There's no sense that she lost anything by coming back to reality, and it flattens what could have been a very compelling scene. Alright, moving on. Episode 6, Nobody Gets the Fleece. Just like the Clarisse reveal in episode 5, the show reveals that Tyson's alive at the start of episode 6. I think this was even less necessary because when he shows up on Polyphemus' island later in the episode, it's a wonderful moment. Percy thought he was dead, and the reunion pushes him to accept Tyson as a brother. It would have been more impactful if we learned of Tyson's survival at the same time as the characters. It's like the writers just can't play with any cards close to their chest. Leading up to Polyphemus' island, in the show, Percy and Annabeth spend a night sleeping on their own ship just offshore. I'm not mad that they showed the characters sleeping, and I like the inclusion of a Thalia-related dream. However, I don't like that Annabeth immediately guesses it was about Thalia. Percy just says he thought he was dreaming of Kronos at camp, then realized it was someone else and uses the pronoun she. He doesn't even mention the lightning, and Annabeth's immediately like, it was Thalia. Can I also say, the fact that they're still wearing the same clothes is wild. I understand not wanting to keep the clothes from Circe's island, but golly, I cannot imagine how nasty I'd feel after all that time. The explosion aboard Princess Andromeda, escaping, the explosion in the Sea of Monsters, washing up on Circe's island, escaping, fighting past the sirens. Nasty. But I digress. Coming back to Polyphemus being more involved in the storyline, it's a bit silly to have his voice over while the camera pans across the island and then cuts to him expositing to Clarisse and Grover. It is a little disturbing to hear him mimic the voices of the satyrs he's killed, but A, like I said last episode, it makes no sense for him to explain himself to his captives, and B, he doesn't use Grover and Clarisse's voices to lure Percy and Annabeth, so what was the point? Oh, and then it is definitely a choice to have Luke iris message Annabeth. Like I mentioned in the Percabeth section, I think it's implied that this is how Luke figures out their location, but it's a little wonky. He asks if she's on Polyphemus's island, but unless Luke can just look at a place and then make a portal there, that doesn't make sense. To my understanding, he got the coordinates from his spies in camp, but like I said, those coordinates were incorrect. I would have preferred he pull a Rise of Skywalker. Like, spoilers, but in that film, Kylo Ren and Rey commune through their Force bond, and they have conversations where they can each see each other but not their surroundings. At the end of one conversation, Kylo Ren reaches and grabs Rey's necklaces and rips them off her neck, and since she got them from a specific planet festival, he's able to figure out her exact location. Something like that would have been fun, like Luke reaching through at the last minute and grabbing like a bit of grass or dirt or something. Another thing, I'm so disappointed by the lack of huge carnivorous sheep. In the book, the sheep are the island's line of defense, and they're a free roaming flock of several dozen. Percy sneaks into the cave by holding onto a sheep's underside, while Annabeth puts on her invisibility cap to distract Polyphemus. In the show, Polyphemus has like 10 normal sheep in a pen. Percy and Annabeth throw on sheep pelts and then crawl with the herd so they can break away a bit later. I can appreciate the humor of Percy and Annabeth buying and Annabeth saying think woolly thoughts, but it's just not as fun. And on a practical level, I'm being serious when I say there are 10 sheep, and I'm expected to believe 2 extras blend in. If the show didn't want to commit to big monster sheep, there at least should have been enough to convince me that Polyphemus might miscount. Anyway, back to Grover and Clarisse in the cave. In the book, Percy and Annabeth discover that Clarisse is being dangled over boiling water in the cave. Polyphemus captured her, and she's about to be cooked and eaten. In the show, she and Grover are tied together with rope, which doesn't create as much urgency. It's another consequence of the abundance of cave scenes. The writers want us to see them talking and sharing emotional moments, but when we see so much of them on screen and they're not about to die or get hurt, the sense of danger wears off. Oh, here's a big change. The book sequence of fighting Polyphemus is way more fun because a majority of the characters aren't stuck in a cave. I get it. It's the helplessness, it's Percy's desperation to save Annabeth, it's the dilemma with the fleece, but you can't tell me we gained more than we lost here. In the book, I loved seeing Clarisse's fighting tenacity front and center. Her stamina in battle is a great match for Percy as they tag team, and it would have been a great opportunity for teamwork in the show since we don't see them work together much. The show went the mental, emotional route instead. Clarisse refuses to give Luke the fleece, while Percy insists they have to save Annabeth no matter what. I'm sure the writers wanted to show Percy's deep care for Annabeth, and the scene is very well acted, but personally, I would have preferred they face Polyphemus after building him up as an antagonist, instead of being stuck in the cave and arguing with each other. Also in the book, the escape builds a fantastic pace since the characters flee from Polyphemus across the bridge, and Percy fails to cut the ropes before he makes it across too. It's a high stakes scene, and Percy's sense of failure motivates him to take Polyphemus down. In the show, there is no escape attempt because they're stuck in the cave the whole time. Anyway, speaking of escape, in the book, Percy temporarily gets the upper hand. He hesitates when Polyphemus begs for his life and says he'll give them the fleece if they let him live. This is, of course, a trick. Oh, look at that, the book hinted at his ability to emotionally manipulate. And as soon as Percy backs up, Polyphemus smacks him down and almost kills him. In the show, Percy's stuck in the cave, and we don't see him demonstrate his strength at all. Lame. In the book, the group makes their way towards the ship, and it turns out Polyphemus survived falling off a cliff and is coming at them with boulders. Percy and Tyson stand off against him while the others swim for the ship. In the show, Tyson fights Polyphemus solo outside the cave while the others are trapped inside, and apparently kills him by taking both of them over the cliff's edge. Tyson's return was well executed, but it's another missed opportunity to showcase Percy's skills. Also, in the book, Percy and Tyson agree to spare Polyphemus's life, and it's an impactful point of understanding between them. Frankly, the show's conclusion that Tyson killing Polyphemus was okay because he's a good Cyclops and Polyphemus wasn't runs counter to the idea that monsters are intelligent and nuanced. As for nuance, in the book, Polyphemus calls Tyson a traitor to Cyclops' kind, which bothers Tyson enough to stand his ground. Polyphemus also invokes Poseidon's name and points out he's a child of the gods too. Percy isn't radicalized enough to understand that yet, but it gives the reader something to think about and lays the groundwork for why Luke has a point. In the show, Polyphemus is gentle towards Tyson at first, not wanting to fight, and Tyson struggles morally because he doesn't want to hurt Polyphemus, but eventually has to in order to save his friends. We could have had that while also adding the point of Polyphemus feeling entitled to the god's favor. It could have all come together. One way or another, Polyphemus is defeated, which leaves us with one more change to talk about. When I watched, as Luke picked up Annabeth's unconscious body and started walking away, then sailed off in their ship, I thought to myself, huh, I don't remember this happening in the book. This definitely happened in the book, though. That would be a drastic change. Imagine my surprise. Luke doesn't kidnap Annabeth in the book. He isn't even on the island. It's hard to outright condemn this change because season 2's remaining plot hinges on it. That's the direction the show chose, so I can't just say bad change because you'd have to throw away all of episode 7 and 8. But I will say, even if it's juicy conflict for the end of the season, Annabeth getting kidnapped here absolutely undermines next season's conflict. And that's not a spoiler because it's literally the description of the third book. That brings us to episode 7, I Go Down with the Ship. Here's where it gets tricky because the entire premise of episode 7 differs from the book. So for the next couple episodes, discussion will go like this. I'll tell you how the roughly equivalent portion of the book played out, and then we'll go over the events of the episode. Lastly, I'll give my thoughts on what worked and what didn't. Let's go. First, the book plot. The group escapes from Polyphemus's island by catching a ride with the hippocampi to Miami Beach. And once they get their bearing, they realize it's actually been 10 days since they left Camp Half-Blood, because as Percy explains, time travels differently in monstrous places. So if they want to save Thalia's tree, they have to get the fleece back to camp that night. Percy uses cash from Hermes' travel bag and tells Clarisse to catch a cab to the airport and to take the fleece with her. She's disbelieving at first, but after he explains that she deserves credit for the quest, she accepts the responsibility and gets in a cab. No sooner has she set off than Luke catches up, bringing them aboard Princess Andromeda once again, and once he finds out that they sent the fleece ahead, he kinda loses his marbles. In order to buy Clarisse some time, Percy tricks Luke by iris messaging Camp Half-Blood in the fountain behind where Luke is standing. Before all of camp, Percy gets Luke to confess his entire plan, including orchestrating the poisoning of Thalia's tree, thus clearing Chiron's name. Tantalus is no longer needed, and Mr. D sends him back to Tartarus before the call disconnects. A furious Luke declares his intent to kill Percy, who goads him into a one-on-one fight. Luke gains the upper hand pretty quickly and injures Percy to the point of defeating him. Luke orders one of his bear giants to eat Annabeth and Grover, at which point Chiron bursts in with his centaur brethren to save them and carry them back to camp. This section is fast-paced and compelling, especially since we see Percy outsmart Luke, who's been 2 steps ahead so far. It's also Luke's second and last book appearance. In this book, that is. We also get more of Luke's rage here, which I discussed in his character section. To quote page 238 when he tells one of his bear giants to prep his steed, "Do it," Luke screamed, "or I'll feed you to the Dracon." The bear man gulped and lumbered down the stairs. Luke paced in front of the swimming pool, cursing in ancient Greek, gripping his sword so tight his knuckles turned white. The rest of Luke's crew looked uneasy. Maybe they'd never seen their boss so unhinged before. The encounter makes Luke feel like a more credible threat, and also like he's spinning out of control for the first time in the book. In the book, Luke reveals that he planned to let Percy have the fleece once he used it to heal Kronos. Percy is suspicious, of course, But it's foreshadowing that Kronos intended to bring Thalia back, and Luke went along with it, maybe hoping his old friend would side with him. My last note is that I enjoy the dynamic of Chiron coming to Percy's aid after Percy cleared his name. Of course, he would have helped Percy either way, but I like that the narrative let him express his gratitude, and it was a bonding moment that we didn't get in the show. With that said, how do things play out in the show? The episode opens with our characters making their way up the pier. They use Tyson's voice mimicking to lure one of Luke's demigods into a building and steal his Princess Andromeda keycard. Clarisse thinks they should go straight for the fleece, while Percy wants to save Annabeth. After gathering information about the ship layout, Clarisse snatches the keycard and sets off on her own. Percy tasks Grover and Tyson with finding transportation back to camp, then heads to the ship too. Clarisse finds a weapons/break room, but gets stuck hiding behind lockers when some demigods come in and start a round of the in-universe card game Mythomagic. If you know, you know. Meanwhile, Percy steals a key card from one of Luke's demigods and encounters a Pegasus named Blackjack on the deck. He finds Annabeth tied to a bed and cuts the ropes binding her, but when Luke comes in, he has to use her invisibility cap to hide. Luke tries to wax poetic about the cause, but Annabeth throws him off by suggesting that the fleece's magic could fully revive Thalia. When Luke mentions where the fleece is, Percy sneaks out to take it, and Kronos speaks to him from the coffin. He tries to convince Percy to leave the fleece by reciting the first couple lines of the Great Prophecy, but Percy grabs it anyway. At that moment, Luke comes in and they face off against each other. Meanwhile, Clarisse hears Allison rally the demigods to go kill the prisoner, aka Annabeth, and decides to abandon her mission and go help her, and they face the members of Luke's army together. So we cut between two fights, Luke and Percy in one-on-one sword combat, and Annabeth and Clarisse gradually defeating the demigods and Laestrygonians. Percy gets around Luke and runs for the elevator, but Luke stabs him just as the doors close. Luckily, he's got the fleece with him, and it heals him as he rides the elevator back up to the deck. He reconvenes with Annabeth and Clarisse, and convinces Clarisse to go ahead with the fleece riding Blackjack. Percy and Annabeth then run to the pier, where Sally pulls up in her car. Grover and Tyson called her when they weren't able to jumpstart a truck. On the drive to camp, Annabeth and Grover excitedly discuss the possibility of Thalia coming back, and Percy looks pensive. Back aboard the ship, Luke asks Kronos why he wasn't informed about the possibility that the fleece could revive Thalia, and Kronos inflicts mental pain on him as punishment for questioning his authority, then orders him to prove his loyalty by killing Percy. We've got quite a few things to discuss. Even though a lot happened, I kind of struggled with the pacing. I think there should have been more action and less conversation, or at least the conversations shouldn't have been so straightforward. I don't want to hear Luke lay down his cards when Annabeth brings up Thalia, expressing doubt towards his own cause. I want smaller things like micro expressions and slight hesitation between words to suggest he might be starting to question things. Show, don't tell. I don't think Luke's uncertainty works in any case, because, like I said in his section, the show wasn't ready for his vulnerability to pay off. If we're seeing how tortured Luke is this early, it makes his upcoming actions seem, quite frankly, reprehensible. And if he's already questioning Kronos, how am I supposed to buy him as Kronos' right hand for the rest of the series? Luke would have been much more nuanced if we saw him go to all these extremes for Kronos, apparently an angry, unstoppable force, and later we found out the trauma he's endured and how all his life events led to his actions. Further, in the book, Luke and Kronos both knew the fleece could resurrect Thalia, a wild card on the board. They were counting on people from camp questing for the fleece so they could indirectly attempt to throw the scales out of balance. It gave us a sense of how far ahead Kronos and Luke were, whereas the show's approach conveys no such thing. My next point is, the entire sequence of the characters getting off the ship suffers from a writing affliction I call convenient pause syndrome. The writers want to deliver a sentiment or piece of information, but can't figure out how to integrate it into the action, so instead, the plot pauses while the necessary moment takes place. That's what happens as soon as the characters reach the deck. Even though there ought to be dozens of monsters and demigods on the ship, Blackjack gets the characters out of trouble with a single sweep of his wings, And then they stand around for way too long while Percy convinces Clarisse to go ahead with the fleece. Precious time during which anything could have happened. The stakes felt greater in the books because it's been 10 days since they left camp. The concept of time passing differently could have been an interesting plot device, a horrifying moment of realization, but the show left it out. That's not the only instance of convenient pause syndrome this episode. Once Clarisse leaves, Percy and Annabeth get to the pier and Sally pulls up in her car. Percy is so in disbelief that even though it's urgent they get to camp as soon as possible, he's told to get in 3 times before he finally gets over his shock and climbs in. During all this, no new pursuers come after them, no one's even vaguely chasing them in the distance as they drive away. I want to feel stakes, not like our characters can get off scot-free when they should be in grave danger. It feels cheap and manufactured when characters can stand around whenever the writers need them to have a conversation and they don't face any consequences for that wasted time. Okay, I just did a good bit of criticizing, so let's pivot to some things I enjoyed. I think the show has done a good job of making Kronos' presence felt. The voice actor, Nick Barain, is superb in this role. Getting to hear his voice, rather than just seeing italicized dialogue on a page, really helped me feel his villainous intent. I also generally enjoyed the action choreography this episode. It was fun to see Clarisse in action when it was actually life or death, and I enjoyed the camera work and editing back and forth between her and Annabeth and Percy and Luke. It felt more dynamic than most of the camera work and blocking in the rest of the season, and it gave the scene a faster pace. I especially like that the writers weren't afraid to have Luke stab Percy, even if he did heal himself with the fleece right away. Given that they refused to show these kids being tired or dirty or hungry, it was refreshing to see them face consequences for their interactions. Do I have anything else nice to say? I think that's it for now. In terms of the scenes on the Princess Andromeda, I thought the book did a better job of showcasing Percy's cleverness and ability to think on his feet. He knew Luke would interpret his drachma toss as a pathetic last-ditch effort to hit him with something, and if he could get Luke mad, he'd start ranting about all the things he thought he got away with. We lose a sense of Percy's intellectual capabilities and his ability to come up with solutions when backed into a corner without a scene of him deceiving Luke. I wish the writers trusted us to understand things without them being spelled out, and I wish we got to see the characters exercise their abilities a little more, or at all, really. On that note, let's talk about the lack of Percy's powers this episode. I liked his fight with Luke for what it was, but I really wish the setting had enabled Percy to utilize his powers like in the book. In the book fight, Luke still gets the upper hand, but Percy only survives for as long as he does by using the ship's fountain and swimming pool to his advantage. Even if the show didn't want to commit to swimming pool and fountain animation, the cruise ship is literally docked by the ocean. If they were going to show that setting anyway, it would have been much more compelling to have the battle outside so Percy could utilize the ocean. I want to feel like he's the son of Poseidon, and it's meant to be a big deal that he is. Lastly, we come to the biggest change of the episode. Annabeth figuring out that the fleece can bring Thalia back to life. When I tell you I yelled while watching, I'm being so serious. This comes back to my point about the writers being like, well, most viewers have read the books, so we don't need to include plot twists and surprises because people already know what's going to happen. As I said earlier, first-time viewers do exist, and even for fans of the book, it's still a richer, more rewarding viewing experience to be immersed in the mystery. Granted, since I saw jokes about the Cersei reveal even before the season aired, I was disappointed but not surprised there. But if you'd given me 10 guesses as to what else would be straight up told to the viewer, I doubt I'd have guessed the Thalia reveal. In the book, the Thalia reveal is the best. It's a great cliffhanger for a book that's otherwise at the bottom of most people's series rankings, and it sets events into motion that serve as the undercurrents for the rest of the series. Even though most viewers knew Thalia would be resurrected, it's a huge disservice to the plot to throw the reveal out the window and give Annabeth some mystical feeling that the fleece could revive Thalia. To rectify this, the show adds a reveal that wasn't in the book, which is that Thalia's last stand didn't play out like everyone thought. Annabeth and Luke assumed the Furies killed her, but in reality, they were informing her of Zeus's goal, turning her into the ultimate weapon against the Titans, the half-blood foretold in the Great Prophecy. Thalia refused, for which he struck her down. I'll first tell you what I like about this. Zeus was pretty much the only season 1 god who embodied the role, from the moment the camera cut to him lounging on his throne. Lance Reddick, Zeus's original actor, tragically passed away in March 2023, and Courtney B. Vance does great justice to the role. He continues to make Zeus one of the show's only true mythological presences. The addition of this reveal shows Zeus's evilness firsthand. In the books, it can be difficult to grasp the god's cruelty until later in the series, so I like seeing up front what Zeus is capable of. It recontextualizes Thalia's death. Even the god's own children are pawns in their larger games, to be discarded as soon as they don't want to play their parts. So in that case, what is it I don't like about the reveal? Well, my big question to you is this. Why did we have to find out about Thalia ahead of time? Wouldn't the reveal have been more impactful if it followed Thalia's shocking return? Picture this. When Percy comes to, Annabeth and Grover greet him at his bedside. Then they hear that Thalia is awake, and Annabeth and Grover race over ecstatic while Percy follows behind, a pensive look on his face. They reach her room where they expect her to be thrilled to see them, but instead she's panicked. Chiron also enters the room, and we get the flashback to the night she died. Chiron says something like, "Dear gods, we've played right into the Titan Lord's hands," and that's the note the season ends on. I've got a vision, okay? This would resolve my other issue with the change, which is how flippantly the characters discuss Thalia's return.
You have a lot to carry. That's why Thalia's gonna help. She can help Percy carry the weight. Take it off his shoulders.
Right. I mean, Thalia's gonna be the one in the prophecy, not Percy?
There's a prophecy?
Isn't there always?
Given the stakes, that tone felt silly. I know the writers wanted Percy to be jealous of his friend's happiness at the prospect of Thalia coming back, but A, the root of that jealousy hasn't been set up like it was in the books, and B, that arguably would have been shown even better in a scenario that included the initial reveal. It's a great build of tension when one epiphany follows another, especially when the implications compound. But anyway, those are my thoughts on episode 7. Finally, we come to episode 8. The Fleece works its magic too well. Starting with the book plot, Chiron and his centaur brethren carry the protagonists to camp. They arrive just after Clarisse and find camp in a pretty haggard state, but once she puts the fleece on Thalia's tree, its healing effect is immediate and everyone celebrates. The next day, Chiron announces that the chariot races are back on, and the night before the race, Hermes visits Percy, and after some discussion about Luke and the messiness of family, he delivers a message from Poseidon, a piece of paper that simply says, "Brace yourself." Before the race, Percy and Tyson share a heartfelt conversation in which Tyson expresses gratitude to Poseidon for sending Percy to be at his side. Percy and Annabeth compete in the race, and amidst shenanigans from other chariots, they ultimately claim the victory. Grover announces he'll keep searching for Pan at the end of the summer, and he and Percy resolve to keep their empathy link. Percy calls Sally to let her know he's okay, and she encourages him to train at camp over the summer until he returns to school in the fall. Tyson announces that Poseidon came to him in a dream and called him to work in his forges, preparing weaponry for the upcoming war. Then, after a night of fitful dreams, Percy wakes to a panicked Grover saying something happened with Annabeth on Half-Blood Hill. They race over, where Percy sees Annabeth kneeling by an unconscious girl. As soon as she opens her eyes and they make eye contact, he realizes who she is: Thalia, daughter of Zeus. This is a wonderful ending to an otherwise average part of the series. We see some enjoyable scenes without crazy stakes, and some important events that set up future story elements. I can only imagine how suspenseful it must have been to wait for the next book if you were reading the series as it was being released. I decided to include this point here instead of in his character section, but at the end of my reread, I really reflected on Grover as a character. In the book, we're solely in Percy's perspective, so he interacts with Grover via empathy-linked dreams till they reunite in person. Even though Grover isn't physically present for most of the story, there is enduring communication, and I thought his personality came through more in his dialogue. Since the show traveled outside of Percy's perspective, there are some dream sequences, but we also see some of Grover's time in the cave. I was curious to see whether that would make his presence feel more anchored, and surprisingly, I think it doesn't. By the end of the season, my feeling about Grover's part in the story mirrored my thoughts about Luke. His significance isn't felt in the book because he appears a bunch, but because his few appearances count for something. In the book, Riordan distills so much of Grover's personality that those moments stick with you and raise the stakes each time. The book accomplished that more effectively than the show, even though Grover was more present in the show's narrative. The reunion is more significant too because he and Percy's relationship has been at the forefront of the story. For example, the conversation where Percy convinces Grover to keep the empathy link. Percy cares about Grover so much, he'd want to know if something was wrong, even though he risks serious injury. I would have loved something like that in the show because we're largely missing a sense of camaraderie among the characters. With that said, let's see how things played out in episode 8, the season finale. As Sally drives the group close to camp, they encounter Blackjack in the middle of the road. Turns out Clarisse didn't make it to camp. There are monsters all around, so she continued on foot. Percy convinces Sally to stay back and out of danger, but before she leaves, Percy admits he's worried her two sides of the same coin dream actually referred to him and Thalia. Tantalus has had a tyrannical grip on camp, but one of the Laestrygonians makes it through the barrier and smites him with a fireball. Yay! We then see the state of Half-Blood Hill. Archers stand just inside the barrier, firing towards giants on the other side of the field, who hurl fireballs in turn. The barrier's holding for now, but it's really only a matter of time. In the woods, reinforcements arrive, more Laestrygonian giants, a group of Luke's demigods, and Luke himself. Also in the woods is Clarisse, and once she runs into a group of campers, including Chris Rodriguez, they make their way towards camp together. Meanwhile, Annabeth, Percy, Tyson, and Grover try to hatch a plan, but are discovered by hostile campers who take them to Mr. D. Mr. D is acting a fool as always and doesn't take Percy seriously until he says Kronos is back. Percy then gives a rallying speech to the other campers, while at the barrier, Luke and his army charge forward through the fog. In the woods, Chris and Clarisse discuss the barrier and strategy, but plot twist, half of the group are Luke's demigods, including Chris. They stab the other demigods and corner Clarisse on the chariot track until Grover and Annabeth arrive, riding in a chariot. They grab the fleece and circle back for Clarisse, and then they ride off. Luke lifts the barrier to let a giant in, but pauses when Percy, Tyson, and a group of campers crest the hill. The two sides charge at each other, clashing in battle, and Luke and Percy face off one-on-one. Luke absolutely levels Percy, I cannot lie, and he's about to kill him when Tyson comes to the rescue. Annabeth, Grover, and Clarisse arrive, prompting Allison and a few other demigods to start hacking at the base of Thalia's tree. Clarisse hurls the fleece at the tree, speared on a javelin, starting the healing process, and at the end, Thalia bursts from the trunk, filling the field with lightning as she and Percy collapse. In a dream, Percy speaks to Poseidon, who warns of the coming war and invites Tyson to work in his forges. Tyson agrees, feeling indebted to Poseidon for sending Percy to save him. Before Percy wakes up, Poseidon tells him not to underestimate himself and to brace himself. Percy wakes up in the infirmary with Grover and Annabeth beside him and Thalia unconscious in the other bed. They head to the big house where Chiron has returned, and Clarisse is also there, and they acknowledge each other with mutual respect. Then, Chiron reveals what actually happened the night Thalia died. The Furies warned her about Zeus's intentions, and Zeus evaporated them with lightning. When he couldn't convince Thalia with words, he evaporated her too. The season ends with Thalia bursting in, reuniting with Annabeth, and asking where Luke is. She and Percy make eye contact, and his voiceover says his nightmare just woke up. Before I launch into critiques, I do want to start with some positivity. First of all, I appreciate the emotional aspect of Percy and Sally's conversation where he convinces her to stay behind. He says he can't risk losing her like he did to the Minotaur the year before. And I feel like Season 1 never really reckoned with Percy's trauma in that regard, so this was a good moment. Similar to the fight choreography in episode 7, I give this episode kudos for showing some bloodshed. We saw people get stabbed, and it was violent, not them just falling over dead. That's the reality of battle, and I'm glad the show didn't totally shy away from portraying that. Along the same lines, I appreciate that the show let Luke beat Percy up instead of treating their fight with kid gloves. The actors' ages have kind of blurred things in the sense that Walker Scobell has visibly aged between seasons while Charlie Bushnell hasn't, but Percy is 13 and Luke is 20. It wouldn't make sense for Percy to match Luke in combat, not only because Luke has years of experience and training to his advantage, but also because Percy hasn't realized his full potential. This episode does a good job reminding us of that. For once, Percy looks as rough as he should given the circumstances, and I wish the show committed to that throughout the season. I want to feel the weight of the journey and what it's cost, even when they come out victorious. I started slipping back into critique at the end, but that's okay because we're getting back into it. We have a couple more cases of convenient pause syndrome this episode. Once the group encounters Blackjack, Annabeth, Grover, and Tyson start heading into the woods because they need to save camp. But it's fine that Percy and Sally pause to have a whole conversation about her being in danger and her dream from the beginning. Yes, I liked the emotions in the scene, but it lasted far too long for the time constraints they're under. This happens again when Annabeth and Percy stroll through the woods after seeing Luke's army arrive, arguing about Thalia's loyalty and the prophecy when they ought to be running to save camp. And Grover and Tyson are apparently walking somewhere behind them. I rewatched the episode to write an accurate plot summary, and I was honestly flabbergasted by how quickly the momentum died with them just walking. Oh, I want to discuss Chris Rodriguez being a traitor a little more. On the whole, I appreciate the change because it is more meaningful for a character whose face we know and who we more or less trusted to be the traitor. That said, I have a few points against the execution. For one, revealing a trusted character as one of Luke's spies at this point suggests the writers might be axing a later storyline that's really important to me and many others. And if that's the case, I'm gonna be pretty upset. Second, the reveal would have had even more impact if he stabbed another character with a speaking role, like Bronte, for example. As it is, Chris stabs a girl named Katie, and while I sympathize with her on the basic notion that I wouldn't want to get stabbed, I had no idea who she was until 2 minutes beforehand. Third, and maybe my biggest point, the show sacrifices narrative cohesion to make sure we can't guess the reveal ahead of time. Let me make one last comparison to show you what I mean. In the film The Rise of Skywalker, we learn there's a spy in the tyrannical First Order. The movie clearly wants you to think it's this new character, General Pride, so anytime the topic comes up, the camera cuts to him looking very suspicious. That's all to prevent you from guessing that the spy is actually General Hux, an established character who seemed dedicated to the cause. When you revisit those scenes after the reveal and ask yourself, does it make sense for General Pride to act like this when he's not actually the spy? The answer is no, he's only acting like this because the narrative requires him to play a red herring. In PJO, leading up to the Chris reveal, we see him being a very active, dedicated camper. He shows a ton of cabin pride during the chariot race, and he's the one who stands up to Tantalus. There isn't a single micro expression to suggest he feels differently from what he's saying. When you revisit those scenes after the reveal and ask yourself, does it make sense for him to be so vocal about camp security if he's on Luke's side? The answer is no, he's only acting like this because the narrative requires him to play a red herring. It would actually be in his best interest to let Tantalus be incompetent, since it would undermine camp security. It took me out of the story because now, A, I know the writers will include things that don't make sense to preserve a twist instead of just writing cleverly, and B, the characters' motivations have lost all cohesion. Speaking of which, Chris's reasoning for being a traitor and killing fellow campers is Luke was always there for me. Like, this is why it'd be more powerful if he was an undetermined camper. He'd feel like Luke understood him and his pain. Instead, he's willing to abandon the community he's thriving in because, what, Luke is his bro? Moving on from that, we have to talk about the way Luke's last name is pronounced in the show.
Hi. Luke Castleman.
Come on now. I've seen other people online being weirded out about the pronunciation, so I'm glad I'm not the only one who thought it was off. For the record, the linguistically correct pronunciation would be Castellan. I'm not an expert in surname etymology, so there could be multiple accepted pronunciations. I just happen to think Castellan is unacceptable. Okay, that was somewhat unserious, but back to business. It's interesting to make Poseidon more involved in Percy's life at the end of the season, but I think removing his involvement at other points, like him sending the hippocampi, undermines a big theme. The point of Hermes imploring Percy to save Luke is family. No matter how much distance, conflict, or hatred flows between family, they're tied to each other in the end. I thought the book added just the right touch of Poseidon's interference. He can't be a traditional father, but he can answer when Percy calls. He can deliver a succinct warning about the danger to come, like he does in the book. Just brace yourself. It's the best way he can look out for Percy while honoring that he's a demigod who needs to find his own way. In the show, Poseidon only shows up once the dust has settled. I realized after rewatching the episode that in the show's canon, he didn't respond to Percy on the camp lakeshore. Hermes appeared because he had his own agenda. This approach does a huge disservice to Poseidon's deep care for Percy, which we were shown in season 1. The way Toby Stephens carries himself in those scenes is incredible. He holds himself at a distance because it's a danger to both of them if he doesn't. I'm disappointed that off the back of that fantastic setup, the writers are relegating Poseidon even deeper in the sidelines. Smaller note here, in the book, even though you'd expect Chiron, Grover, and Annabeth to be thrilled about Thalia's return, they recognize the danger this poses. To quote page 279, even Chiron, Annabeth, and Grover, who should have been celebrating this moment, were too shocked, thinking about what it might mean for the future. In the show, her return is treated as solely positive by everyone but Percy, who is apparently the only one questioning if some bad could come of it. Considering the show leaned into the idea that Zeus wanted to turn her into a weapon, it would have made more sense to show other people's fear that Kronos could manipulate her too. Alright, a few smaller notes to end this section. In the book, we get a valuable description of the damage done to camp and the campers. To quote page 254, the big house's rooms were overflowing with wounded. The kids in the Apollo cabin, who were the best healers, have been working overtime performing first aid. In the show, Chris mentions they've suffered from multiple giant attacks, and there are archers bravely defending the border. However, the show doesn't really dwell on human injury or loss, which dampens the realism. I understand the writers wanted to end the season with our main characters, but surely we could have taken 1 or 2 minutes to show some of the damage first. Finally, even though it was fun to have a big battle scene, it came at the cost of letting other areas of the story breathe. The writers could have taken that screen time to flesh out character relationships, let mysteries unfold, establish environments and important minor characters. Instead, they added an entire episode's worth of content that didn't take place in the book. You might say, Autumn, just enjoy the fun show for what it is. You're comparing it to the book too much. Maybe that's how you feel about this whole video. It's okay if you do. At the start of this whole thing, though, I disclaimed that I can't fully separate the adaptation from its source material. My critiques on the season's writing and visuals included more objective judgments on cohesion and flow, so I think I've shown I'm not basing my opinion solely on comparison. But I can't change that I know the tree that bore this fruit, that I loved the tree first, that this fruit does not carry the spirit of its origin as I was promised. This is not the book-accurate adaptation I was promised. That brings us to the end of this video. We've talked about a lot today, light on the compliments and heavy on the critique. I want to reiterate that I still love these stories and these characters, and I believe the show can improve. I would love to get a decent 3rd season, a good 4th season, and a fantastic final season. That would completely save my opinion of the show, and I'd laud it as a wonderful adaptation that just took a bit to find its footing. The writers simply need to take people's feedback seriously. Viewers have pretty much offered a blueprint for how to improve the writing and the characters, and I want to see that implemented. This is a beautiful universe with so much whimsy, nuance, and depth. I don't want to keep losing that to Disney-fied dialogue and bizarre narrative changes. Thank you for watching, and if you've made it to the end, thank you for your dedication. I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything and everything I discussed, or anything I left out. If you enjoyed this video or got something out of it, make sure to leave a like and share with fellow Percy Jackson lovers. If you want to enjoy more discussions like this, make sure to subscribe. That's all for today. I'll see you the next time I open my notes app. Bye!